over here? Huh? I prefer leather.
They're new. We're loving the chairs.
Yeah, the chairs are good. So because they're clearance, they're short.
They've been nice.
Yeah. Are they comfortable?
Let's do it.
Do you want me to actually go? Go find Christine.
You know, the team actually knows where you're going to be. Danielle,
Yeah. One sec, we have them right back here.
it's all pinned down.
I thought she said we have them right back here.
Why don't you put those black marks on?
are the key. So the key is not here. Dishing.
But not yet. Right here. Oh, you're welcome. No. We do have 60 buildings, right?
Please welcome to the stage Atlantic Live President Margaret Lowe.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and thank you all for being here. I'm so glad to see so many of you here for this Atlantic Forum, the Cyber Frontier. I think as everybody in this room knows, we're all increasingly reliant on technology in every aspect of our lives, and while it makes us more efficient and more connected, we're also at much greater risk. Because cyber hacks are becoming one of the most serious threats of our time. It's a peril to our privacy, a danger to our critical infrastructure, and costing hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and that number is from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And attention is being paid. Today, more than half of the websites any of us visit are encrypted with the intention of protecting us, not always successful, of course. The federal government is working to develop regulations that will ensure a higher level of security across sectors, and academic institutions are training a new generation of cyber experts. We're going to talk about all of that this morning and about how to build a safer web, protect critical infrastructure, and we'll look at what's happening on the cyber frontier around the world. Before we get started, I want to thank our underwriter, Accenture, for making this morning possible. We're grateful for your support, Accenture. And one additional note, this is more concrete, please silence your cell phones, but don't put them away because we are on Twitter at Atlantic Live, and we hope you'll join the conversation using the hashtag Atlantic Cyber. We'd love you to be part of the conversation in the room, so we're going to make time for your questions after each conversation. And we will set the stage for the day with a view from the Hill on cybersecurity legislation. For that, we're joined by Texas Congressman Will Hurd, a member of the House Homeland Security Committee. Welcome. And here to lead the conversation is my colleague, the Atlantic's Washington editor-at-large, Steve Clemens. Welcome.
Establishment intelligence, you'd come to intimidate me. Everybody, George Little, he's a spokesman for the CIA, Pentagon. You're not going to intimidate me. Maybe him.
Why is he sitting right in front of me?
I know, yeah.
You know, that's a little weird.
Oh, Congressman, it's great to be with you again. This is I walked in and I was talking to Gus from Accenture this morning, saying, I'm fairly depressed about this topic in the sense that in the many years that I've had the privilege of interviewing you or talking about the cyber health of the country and what's going on, you just read every day another shocking revelation. The North Koreans just sold the war plans from the U.S. government and the South Korean government about what we might do. The Securities and Exchange Commission hacked, doesn't tell anybody for 2 years. There's a lot, Equifax, there's a lot of things going on. And I'm just interested in, you're the cyber guy, the cyber diva in Congress.
I don't know how I feel about that title. But,
in my world, it's a compliment. But I would tell you that I want to just get a sense from you because you're trying to fix things.
Sure.
And you have a lot of Republican colleagues and Democratic colleagues. And I just wonder, what is your own assessment when you get up every morning and saying, crap, another big company went down or the U.S. government got hacked?
So I'm hopeful that we can get it right because most of these major attacks are not zero-day exploits. Zero-day exploit being something that's previously unknown. So it's not like these are incredibly sophisticated attacks. It is people, the defenders, not doing basic stuff that is good when it comes to digital system hygiene. So if you patch your software, if you have strong passwords, if you make sure that folks don't have that people's permissions to data is right, you can defend against 85% of the kind of attacks that are happening. And so, but that's why it also makes this issue so frustrating, is because if you do the basics, you should be defending your digital infrastructure. And because we're not doing the basics, that's why we have the OPM hack. That's why we have Equifax as a problem. And so that's how I would look at the state of this.
Congressman, we're 17 years into the 21st century. And I remember year 2000, Andy Grove, the former chairman and CEO of Intel, was lobbying Congress about the concerns about Y2K and about the vulnerabilities we had there. It seemed like we met that challenge and then have gone to sleep for 15 years. Tom Udall just gushed praise on you. This is a Democratic senator gushing praise on you and what you did with modernizing government, getting more resources and awareness. Why is the system so slow? Why has it taken 17 years for Will Hurd to come in and say we need to modernize our government systems and be smarter on IT? Just what's going on?
Well, I think there needs to be an improved common body of knowledge, not only in Congress, but in the executive branch as well, recognizing and understanding the threats. And
tell me what that means, an improved body of knowledge. I don't get it.
So look, many of my colleagues think the dark web is direct messaging within Twitter, right?
Or WhatsApp.
Right. Yeah. Right. So it's some basic things like that we need to improve. We need to make sure that agency heads are responsible for cybersecurity. We're seeing that trend change in the private sector, where this is no longer just seen as a cost center, cybersecurity that is. It is something that's invaluable to the basic operations of a company. And that's why you have CIOs and CISOs report directly to CEOs, or they're considered to be part of the C-suite. We need to have that same kind of mentality and culture here in the government. There's still, I believe, 14 of the, there's 24 CFO agencies. These are the big agencies in the federal government. I think 14 still have a CIO that doesn't report to the deputy agency head or the agency head. And so you have to make sure that culture is there. And what I've tried to do is just be persistent, continue to shine a light on the problem, bring people back in over and over and make them answer these questions.
I know you've been thinking a lot about personnel. If I were a graduate of MIT today in some very sophisticated stuff in the IT world, and I had a couple of piercings and tattoos and just stayed up all night, slept during the day, wore a lot of black. If I get offered a fortune to go work for Intel and I can be who I am versus going to work for the US government, that represents a fork in the road. And what I think you've been worried about, the absence of really competent talent going into the US government and being drawn in the private sector. So where does my creative MIT, digital horizon go, and how do you deal with that?
Look, we need that person to continue to going in industry. We need that person to be a white hat hacker. We need, that community is important to our digital ecosystem. But what the government needs to accept is that we're never going to compete with the private sector for jobs. And that's okay, but how can we compete? And the concept and what I'm working on is this thing called the Cyber National Guard.
Right.
If you're a kid and you want to go...
Is that hashtag Cyber National Guard?
Hashtag Cyber National Guard. You heard it here first. It is, if you're in high school and you want to go to college in something around cybersecurity, we're going to find you some scholarships, some federal dollars to do that. And it may not even be a 4-year program, but you're going to get federal dollars, and then for however long you got scholarship money, you have to serve in the federal government for that length of time. So you're not going to go work at the NSA or the CIA or DOD. You're going to go work in the Department of Interior. You're going to go work in the U.S. Census Bureau. You're going to work in Department of Homeland Security, other places where we need folks that have these talents. And then after you've served and you go work in the private sector, that private sector company is going to loan you back into the federal government for, let's call it, 10 days every other quarter. And so you achieve cross-pollination of ideas.
What do I get out of that?
You being?
The National Guardsman.
Well, the National Guardsman is you are exposed. The networks are so big in the government. There's no other place where you can get that kind of exposure, and so you get a skill set that is important when you go to the private sector, and also you're getting school paid for, right? And so that's the value. And then when you go and work in that company, the company is going to appreciate this because they're getting an insight into what's happening in the federal government. The federal government is benefiting from having someone that has exposure in the private sector, and that's where we're going to start making sure that the private sector and the public sector are working a little bit closer together. And we have we have the U.S. Digital Service,
Right.
And these are for high-speed, low-drag folks that are going to come work for the government for 2 years. Okay. Why not have a second section which manages this Cyber National Guard, where if I'm a guardsman, let's say I'm going to be employed in the USDS for 4 years, but really I'm getting loaned back for 20 days a year.
Is this proposal legislation yet?
We are working on the text as we speak.
Who is your Democratic partner?
There's plenty of folks that want to
Put a wanted sign out there,
Yeah.
help wanted.
Yeah, we haven't established that, but look, there are plenty of people that I work with a lot on the Democratic side when it comes to these types of issues. But we want to make sure we start getting some actual text down so everybody knows exactly what we're trying to achieve.
Will, you were a spy.
I was spy master technically.
You were a spy master. Yeah, you were a spy. I mean, you were literally. I mean, I'm not even joking. You were generally a spy, and that's maybe why George Little is here.
Yeah, I know.
Worked for the CIA.
That's why I'm not looking at him.
And worked for the CIA. You did covert. And I have not read David Ignatius's new novel, A Quantum Spy. It just arrived there, but I did read over the weekend John le Carre's book, A Legacy of Spies. I don't know if anybody read le Carre's latest book. Yeah, I happen to love it. But how much digital stuff was in that book? Almost nothing. So it gave me a snapshot of what old spycraft was like. You know, it was drop boxes. It was the way, I mean, it took you back into George Smiley days that I thought, wow, that preceded the age and the ecosystem we're in now. Ignatius is interesting in the stuff that he writes in the novels because he's looking at financial intelligence and how you target people and drones and sensors and hacking cars. And I don't know what quantum spy is, but you were a spy. And I just want to know how good or bad are our intelligence capabilities when you look at what's happening in the world, what other governments are doing?
So our intelligence capabilities are still the best in the world, right? But
On what basis?
We can improve. It's because of the talented individuals. And let's use 9/11 as an example.
Yeah.
The day I drove my Toyota 4Runner from San Antonio, Texas to Washington, D.C. was the day of the USS Cole. That was the U.S. destroyer in the Gulf of Aden off the coast of Yemen that was bombed by Al-Qaeda. I was in the CIA when 9/11 happened. On September 12th, I was like the 4th or 5th employee in CTCSO, the Counterterrorism Center Special Operations Division, which prosecuted the war in Afghanistan. If you would have asked me then, would it be 16 years before another major attack on the homeland, I'd said, you're crazy. Something's going to happen, right? And the fact that we haven't had an attack like that in 16 years is a testament to the men and women in the intelligence services, our diplomatic corps, that are working hard every single day, doing really hard things. When you're in the CIA, and you get tasked with, hey, you got to stop this, you don't say, hey, boss, we don't have enough, our budget's not big enough, or we don't have enough people. You go do the job, all right? And that's that can-do attitude that persists. So our intelligence services have to be right every single time. Bad guys have to be right once. But where we can improve, especially in the digital world, our banks have a better idea of where Russian malware is going to come and attack them next, okay? Because they deal with this millions of attacks per month. So
do you think Russia is a serious threat to the United States?
100% it is. 100% it is. They are our adversary, not our ally. And so let's take what these assumptions our banks have, turn those into collection priorities, okay? Task our core collectors, people that did the job that I used to do, and go collect that information and then get it back in the hands of our friends in the private sector so that they can defend against that next level attack. So we shouldn't have any hubris within the federal government, within our collectors saying we know everything. I speak at as many high schools as I can. I always tell the kids, I know what I know what I don't know, but what I don't know is the largest of those three categories. And in the NSA, in the CIA, in DOD, we have to accept that there's a lot out there that we don't know, and we should be leveraging the talent out in the private sector to help us fill those gaps. And so turning private sector assumptions into collection requirements, it's not hard. Tasking core collectors, it's fairly easy. But getting that information back in the hands, that is a difficult problem, and that's what some programs are trying to do, and that's something that I'm interested in working on as well.
You have been pretty critical of the Obama administration for having essentially created silos that made it hard for this kind of information awareness to be communicated, particularly overseas with export control issues. I'd love to just get a chance to understand whether any of that has been fixed in this new administration.
So has some of that been fixed? No. And I would say Tony Scott.
Maybe you can explain to the audience better than I can what your objection was.
Well, so it is. There was a number of issues, but first and foremost, I still believe, and just my criticism of the previous administration was not a partisan thing, because I do believe one of the last few issues in Washington, D.C. that is truly bipartisan is cybersecurity, and so we have to. A big issue was this thing called Wassenaar. This was other countries saying that anything that can be used in a cyber world that a bad guy can use should be considered under export controls. And so that meant that if Accenture was doing a technical vulnerability assessment of a entity in Italy, and the things they learned, they emailed to their office back here in Washington, D.C., they would have violated an export control, right? That's crazy. Now, I would say this process worked because this was a multilateral forum overseas, and the State Department came back and said, this is what we're going to implement. Commerce was the implementing agency. They sent out, a summary of what's going to happen. The entire security community, reacted. Congress, we did hearings on this, and Commerce said, hey, we need to pump the brakes on this and go back to Wassenaar and renegotiate. So we're still currently in that renegotiation to fix that. But I think this was an example where the entire process worked to make sure that the input from the private sector was used to fix some official position. And this is where I think a lot of these international issues need to be faced. Now I also have a problem with many of our European allies that they try to use the specter of Snowden, saying that the U.S. doesn't appreciate privacy, when that's a fallacy, because Germany, who is also one of the biggest countries criticizing the United States, the government owns like a third of the telecommunications infrastructure. The BND, their local service, can do things against German citizens in Germany that the NSA and the FBI would never have dreamed about doing. And so there's a disconnect there with many of our allies.
One of the questions we were just talking about is, we read a lot about what the Chinese are doing to penetrate systems, OPM, various companies, corporate espionage, what the Russians are doing in hacking. And I'm just interested, is the United States doing any of this?
Ask him. Now, look, I
know we did Stuxnet, but Stuxnet seems so small and trivial now when we look at the scale of what other state players are doing in the cyberspace. So we know about Stuxnet. We know that Israel and the United States engage in this. We don't know a lot, and I guess I know you know the secrets, and I just want to know whether we should feel confident or we should feel like we're pathetic.
So the United States still has, when you look at capabilities, and you compare this against other advanced persistent threats, that's the term of the baddest of the bad. We're in that top tier, period, end of story. Are we using the capabilities that we have enough, is I think the better question. And my answer would be no. And let's take Eastern Ukraine as the example. The Russians are using the latest and greatest tactic, techniques, and procedures in electronic warfare in Eastern Ukraine. Are we utilizing the latest and greatest in counter electronic warfare in Eastern Ukraine to stop, to protect our ally, Ukraine, and to counter the Russian aggression? The answer is no. And so who is the equivalent of the Navy SEALs when it comes to electronic warfare? And if somebody knows the answer, I'm still trying to figure that out.
Cool. You can see him right after.
Yeah.
Quantum computing.
Yes.
You have regularly said that we're not doing enough in this space. It's a blind spot. We need to devote more resources to quantum computing. I want to know why, and I want to know who's blocking you.
Yeah. So Vladimir Putin, a couple weeks ago, said that whoever masters AI is going to
run the world.
He's wrong. It's whoever masters quantum computing is going to be the sole hegemon. And quantum computing is important because it completely negates how we do encryption right now. And so that means the digital tools and tactics we've been using to protect information for 50 years is going to be negated. And that means if you have, let's say the Russians or the Chinese, has sucked in all this data that's encrypted, you can't read it right now. Whoever gets quantum computing is going to be able to break that and read that information. So whoever gets there first is going to have a significant leg up.
So who's your opponent politically on this?
Well, there's nobody politically against doing more when it comes to quantum computing, making sure we have the federal funds for basic research that supports this, and making sure that we're working with industry. There's folks in Silicon Valley that are working on this, folks here in Washington, D.C. that are working on. Many of our allies, the Canadians in the Waterloo region, are very involved in looking at quantum computing. But we have to make sure we're focused on this. And it's hard for, look, I still think that, to me, and I have a higher than average, better understanding of this. To me, quantum computing is still a philosophical exercise, right? Because a bit can be a 1, a 0, both, neither, or all four, all at the same time. Like that's a concept that's really hard. Thanks for the couple of engineers that giggled. It's a tough concept because it's so different than what we've always known. A bit can be 1 or 0, it's on or off, right?
In the aggregate, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being very literate, what is the digital literacy of your colleagues, the cyber literacy of your colleagues?
4?
Yeah,
4. No, but let me say this. Though. They understand the threat. They understand that this is a problem and something needs to be done, right? And so the recognition that there is a problem is 9. What we do about it and how we solve it, that's a lot lower. And being able to evaluate many of the different issues is difficult. Because look, there's still some basic questions that we haven't answered. What is a digital act of war and what's an appropriate response? Different parts of the federal government has opinions,
right,
but there's not something that we have agreed to. And so if you can't, if I believe there should be some red lines saying if X is done, Y is going to be a response.
So before I go to the audience, last question, since you mentioned active war, do you share Bob Corker's concerns that the president's lack of temperament or his behavior is tilting us towards World War III?
I think the national security team that we have is one of the first rate. The fact that, what I find funny is...
But the team is different than the president.
Well, but the president's the person that selected the team,
right?
And so the fact that we're in direct negotiations with the North Koreans is a 12th or 13th story is crazy. If this would have happened 9 years ago or 10 years ago, people were like, oh my God, I can't believe we're having direct conversations with the North Koreans. Why is it not within the 6-party talks framework? So as long as there's dialogue between us and the North Koreans, I don't think you're gonna have World War III. And one of the things I learned when I was in the CIA, be tough with tough guys and nice with nice guys. And so we have to be tough with the North Koreans.
Thank you. Let me open up the floor. Yes, right here. Good morning.
Good morning. I believe it was 2 nights ago that Rod Rosenstein tried to rebrand encryption backdoors as responsible encryption. I'm wondering if that the rebranding has swayed your opinion
How do
any.
you feel about the moniker responsible encryption?
No, look, it's real simple. Encryption is good for our national security. It's good for our economy. We should be strengthening encryption, not weakening it. And it's technically impossible to have strong encryption with any kind of backdoor in it. And so this is a conversation that we're going to be involved in forever. I don't know what crypto war we're in right now, right? Is it 5? Is it 6? But this is an issue that is going to be going on for a long time. And for me and many of our colleagues, you can protect our digital infrastructure, chase bad guys, and protect our civil liberties all at the same time. It's hard, but we can do it. And our civil liberties are not burdens. They're the things that make our country great. And so yeah, you can call it whatever you want, but make sure you have strong encryption, period, in the story.
Yes, right up here in front. He's going to hold the mic for you.
Hi, my name is Tika McCullough. I was wondering if you could give your thoughts on cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin and the regulation of things like that.
Well, look, I don't have, I haven't, I look more at blockchain than I do cryptocurrency, right? And so I think blockchain.
Are they different?
They are different. Blockchain was ultimately the technology that allowed the kind of cryptocurrency to happen.
But don't you need Bitcoin or something like that to create the backbone to reward
you're not rewarding. A blockchain is just a distributed ledger, right?
Yeah.
That you can see any kind of changes, and not one person holds it, and so you can use it in customs, right? Merck's and IBM and DHS is working on a way on how you can use a blockchain to move products across the world. Walmart is using it to make sure they know where their cantaloupes have been. So if there's a listeria or some other issue, they can look immediately, this was in this facility, anything that went through this, let's find it. And so I've been focusing on blockchain as a tool that the federal government can be using in order to streamline processes. When it comes, I don't think we're going to get to a point where cryptocurrencies is the currency of the world. But I'm not knowledgeable enough about the nuance. All I do know is folks that have cryptocurrency, they've been targets of a lot of interesting attacks. One of the things I never learned is make sure you call your cell phone and make sure that you can't port your number to another cell phone, because hackers have been taking advantage of two-factor authentication in order to steal Bitcoin and things like that. So it has introduced a different type of attack on individuals that have this. So, but yeah, I think a lot of folks are still talking about this.
I just want to say the Atlantic loves having conversations with you. We cover so much territory. We've run out of, we're going to end right now, but one of the things that we didn't get to, but I hope we can next time is the distinction between dumb walls and smart walls, and how the kind of technology, sensors, whatnot, creates the kind of conditions you want, because I know you're not supportive of dumb walls, right?
Yes, I like that.
Yes or no?
That is. I concur with the good gentleman from the Atlantic. Look, building a 30-foot high concrete structure from sea to shining sea is the most expensive and least effective way to do border security. And the reason we haven't been able to get operational control of our border in 2017 is we haven't looked at all 2,000 miles of our southern border at the same time. And the only way we do that is with technology. It's a fraction of the cost. We can do implementation, and all the data we get, we can beam it to the men and women that are keeping us safe. So,
ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Will Hurd of Texas, thank you so much. Thank you.
Accenture, defining a cyber moonshot, the journey to cyber resilience. Please welcome Gus Hunt, the Managing Director of Accenture Federal Services Cyber Practice.
All right. So first, thanks particularly to the Atlantic for great cooperation and us pulling together this event together. This has been absolutely terrific, and we're thrilled to be partnering with you on something I think is just so important for us to talk about. And thank you to Representative Hurd for actually setting a lot of the stage for what I want to cover today in this very quick talk about this concept that we're calling the cyber moonshot across the board. And so before we step in, this is what I want to do. I wanted to introduce the cyber moonshot concept and help people understand that this is a call to action, okay? It's about us changing the game in cyber, swinging the pendulum back in our favor and aggressively attacking the cyber problem to position us on the high ground. It's about establishing leadership and concerted action to accomplish a goal, and it's something that I think we have to do now, and we can't put it off any further. Right? Our intention is to really stop talking about the problem, although I will talk about the problem a little bit in the next couple of pages coming up here, and then to act coherently to address it. Right? So it's not that we don't have action, I just think that we don't have sufficient coherent action that allows us to move aggressively forward in a common direction. We want to set a BHAG, you guys know this term, big, hairy, audacious goal of shifting the balance of cyber power in our favor and establishing a secure cyber foundation that we can, with confidence, build a future on. Right? And it's about creating real and demonstrable change in the nation to make the nation's data secure and the nation itself cyber safe within 5 years. And that's the cyber moonshot. All right, so as we all know, and you've heard this too often, by any measure, and you just heard several of them up here, the things are bad and getting worse in cyberspace, right? And this is true despite an increasing rate of cyber spending across all private sector and government and things like that. The hard work of so many brilliant people that are trying to address the problem and bring solutions to bear, and our astounding investments. If anybody ever goes to RSA and attends the conference campus, the amazing investments we have in new technology, new capabilities that are constantly appearing on the horizon and across the board. We know the fact that threat velocity continues to increase. Nation states no longer hide their hands. I think that's one of the most scary outcomes that's occurred recently across the board. We have breaches that affect hundreds of millions of US citizens and billions of people worldwide across the board, and active meddling in election attempts and things like that, right? So all those things have been happening, right? So what's really interesting to me personally is even my parents, my mom is 88, my dad is 93, they are now asking me and holding conversations on a regular basis, asking me about, how can I be safe and what's going on, and they're really worried about the fact that their personal safety is in jeopardy if they use services in cyberspace, and that their hard-won savings are in jeopardy if they're not careful about these things, right? So imagine, this is a conversation which is elevated to a point that I don't think we've ever had it before with just basic constituent people across the board, right? And now, given all those other things, comes this wonderful world of the Internet of Things, where we're going to have a 10 to 100-fold increase in connected devices across the board, right? And this is a world of boundless opportunity. I mean, if you look at what we'll be able to do through the Internet of Things, it's an astounding thing, right? Better healthcare, more efficient citizen services, fully smart and integrated cities, reduced greenhouse gas emissions, agile, adaptive military forces that enable us to deal with things on a much better basis, right? It's also the world of cyber nightmares. Security is an afterthought in this mad rush to market around smart devices across the board, right? And in a world where you're only secure as your weakest link, the fact that you have 100 times as many devices connected means you have 10,000 additional points of attack that can be brought to bear against you, through any mechanisms there, right? And so the numbers are overwhelming, right? And we've already seen an incident of this through the Dyn attack, the Mirai botnet that took place a while ago, all right? Anyhow, so this, I believe, is the biggest crisis looming on the horizon, and it's already running us down, right? And we can't continue business as usual because the numbers simply don't scale. We cannot throw people at the problem. The math simply does not work, right? So fortunately, in this case, hope is on the horizon, and I'll hit this a little bit through AI and machine learning. We talked a little about this. Quantum computing, I think, might be able to help in some of these areas as well, too. All right? But I think we can all agree that solving our cybersecurity challenge and making the nation's data secure, our citizens safe, protecting our critical infrastructure is maybe the single most important thing that we can drive to achieve, today. The world's economies are completely interdependent on this thing called the internet, and cybersecurity is a problem that thus affects all of us across the United States, across the globe. It knows no boundaries, and it has no bias, right? So it's not something that we're going to do. We used to worry about this thing called MAD, mutually assured destruction, right? Many years ago when I was a kid. This is important to what's going to follow up here in the rest of the talk. Now we worry about a new MAD, mutually assured darkness, right? So the ability for people to disrupt our economic foundation of our modern world, damage, destroy our life essential services, and rupture the fabric of our society and our daily lives is not the stuff of science fiction, but it's a very, very real problem. Okay. So for the next few minutes, I want to give our thoughts on what it's going to take to land this thing we call the cyber moonshot. So let's roll back in time. When the original moonshot was proposed by President Kennedy, there were 3 specific things that actually led to its success. One was inspirational leadership, right? The second was a specific call to action in order to accomplish a goal that many thought was unattainable at the time. And the third was a commitment from Congress to provide sufficient funding so that they could do sustained investment in order to accomplish the objectives that were set out, right? And this is what's most important about this. It was a challenge that ignited the nation to work together. It excited the passion of young minds. I wanted to be an astronaut, all right? It focused our energies and our attentions and brought government, private industry, and academia together in the pursuit of an audacious goal that many thought was unachievable. We need this today in the cyber realm, right? That kind of purpose, focus, and energy to drive this forward, right? Even Hollywood and the consumer industry were in on the mission, right? So Star Trek came out as part of in the same era as the moonshot that was being developed and going on, to boldly go where no man has ever gone before, right? We still use that phrase today. You'll see it a lot, right? But more importantly, we had Tang. Okay, the astronauts drink. I drank a lot of Tang as a kid, I have to tell you, right? And so today, we need to ignite that same passion, that same attention, joint action, focus on a much harder, right, and much more important problem to make the nation cyber safe. Right, and I think the citizens of our country deserve nothing less. Right, so I want to emphasize that when you think about this, back in that day, almost all of the basic science technology was already well understood, and a lot of it was already in place, right? We had rockets, we knew about escape velocity, knew the mass of the moon, we'd built space capsules, we had spacesuits, and yes, we even had Tang, right? Tang preceded the Apollo program. 1958 was actually when Tang was invented, all right? Okay, but it took a visionary challenge to bring it all together in order to put it in a way that allowed us to accomplish the goal, okay? We are in the same position today, right? We actually really well understand the problems that are out there, right? We have a lot of great technology. We know what it takes to be successful in many, many areas across the board. We have exemplars of success that we can take advantage of, right? But we lack, I believe, this coherent focus to make us work well together and to drive to a common achievable goal. So again, it's not that we're not having action, it's that we lack a coherent focus on action in order to drive us forward and get the job done. All right. So I'm going to focus quickly on 5 things I think are really essential for us to really look at to drive ourselves forward as we do these things, right? So most important, well, the 5 things I'll get to. Most important, we have to think about this as a journey. It took 8 years to put the man on the moon and bring them home again, right? So you can't look at this as a one and done. It's something that we're going to be on a pathway to achieve for a while, okay? And we'll need a systematic and methodical approach in order to get there, okay? Our goal has to be to figure out how to leap ahead of our adversaries, and we have to bring a different mindset. So we're going to have to apply techniques that our adversaries use against us in order to actually build defenses in a way that make it much harder for them to be able to do the things that they want to be able to do. Right? So beyond basic hygiene, which as Representative Hurd said is absolutely critically important to do, okay? It is really, I think there's these, we should be actively moving into 5 particular areas that I think deserve a lot of focus. Right? First and foremost, along with basic hygiene, which is a passive, reactive thing, but critical to do, we now need to step aggressively into proactive defense. Right? We have to stop firefighting, right? And we have to begin to start fireproofing. We have to apply proven and effective practices, hunting, red teaming, continuous vulnerability scanning, to probe and root out attacks and APTs before they get a chance to do damage and sit in our systems and do things like that, right? We have to bring to bear machine learning in particular and AI in particular to enable detection and response at machine speed, and we must do this in order to deal with the IoT challenge that's facing us as we move on ahead. All right, you have to go to the cloud, all right? I mean this very, very seriously. What's really interesting about the cloud is not what its capabilities are today, but the fact that within the cloud there are nascent capabilities that we can take advantage of that will enable us to redefine how we approach security and are critical enablers of getting to cyber resilience. And this is the latent promise of the cloud. Right? We have to go and harden our data, right? We've talked about this a lot. Most of the events we've seen in the past have all been about the fact that we didn't harden our data sufficiently. And I believe that because we've known how to do this for a long time, there's actually no excuse for doing it. So tokenization, encryption, microsegmentation, and blockchain, which was mentioned earlier, we now have techniques and capabilities that I believe give us no excuse not to harden data and things like that. All right, we have to do security by design. Security must be built in at the beginning of every action. We ought to move ourselves into a world of DevSecOps and agile methods and bring together business IT and security at every sprint and every step along the way so that you can make the most effective use of your dollar spent, right? And that's what's critical, because in a limited budget world, how do you make the most effective use of your dollar? Right? And then finally, the goal is to build in cyber resilience, all right? Resilience is an ability to take a licking and keep on ticking. And so for those of you old enough to remember, that's the Timex line from the Apollo days. All right, for those of you young enough, I'm sorry, yet another moonshot era reference that you may not recognize, okay? But remember, it's not about cyber perfection. And I think that's probably one of the other things that we've been dealing with is this thing of cyber protection, all right? So keep in mind, absolute security is absolutely impossible, all right? So design systems to be resilient and tolerate cyber failure and yet enable mission and business and things to keep on working despite the fact that an event has occurred, right? Build and deliver cloud-native applications to take full advantage of these advanced cloud features, fully leverage things like elastic computing and software-defined networking, all right? Which the objective here is let's make it a shell game. If they can't find you, they can't attack you, and we know how to do this, okay? We know how to hide ourselves, and then apply really some advanced techniques, deterministic code development and polymorphic code, development techniques, harden applications, and turn us into a polymorphic attack surface instead of the adversary being a polymorphic attacker on us, right? All of these things are real today, okay? Some albeit more mature than others across the board, I don't deny that. But just as in the Apollo program, it was the ingenuity of the people themselves and a focus to action that we could bring things together in a way that actually created a much better outcome across the board, right? So I'm running slightly over time, so I'm going to apologize for that. But I think what I want to make sure you understand is we don't want to oversimplify the problem, right? This is a really difficult thing to do. All right, and given the complexities, the myriad around it, it's just, there's more to this than what I mentioned. And so other things I'd like you to keep in mind as we look at this and drive to a cyber moonshot is around providing things like incentives so that to harden data and systems that actually outweigh the cost of inaction. Okay? And today, I don't think we have those in place, right? Our current approach to cyber, I think, is actually broken. We have an every man for themselves approach, all right, to deal with this thing, and that just exacerbates the situation. And in a world of the weakest link, we are all held hostage by those who don't have sufficient resources in order to make themselves a really strong cyber posture. Talent remains a huge issue across the board, and we have to solve that problem. But by the way, I will tell you, the every man for himself approach exacerbates that problem and makes it difficult and creates this competition for limited resources. So think common shared services. And then we got to find ways to share data. You heard that also. We must share data. I think we need to look at cyber threat data as a common good for the common people and use it and find ways to make it immediately available for everybody to take advantage of and do, okay? So of course, there are many other challenges and things like that, but what this is all about is bringing us together to achieve a common goal for the good of all, okay? Because it's going to take all of us to land the cyber moonshot, all right? So anyhow, I want to close by saying, keep in mind that it's not that we're not doing great things. It's just that we believe that we're lacking coherent purpose and vision and a call to action to do this. And that's the objective of the cyber moonshot. So when you leave here today, I hope you'll join us for the call for the moonshot. I hope that you'll provide leadership and commitment and that we need to achieve it. Okay, and I establish a relentless focus on the goal and understand what it means for your organization across the board. Okay, and then go tell others about it. We have papers that go into detail on what I just talked about out front, so please pick up several copies and take it to your friends. We'll also make sure they're available to you digitally. And as I didn't ever change my slides when I was going through this thing and talking across the board, we'd like to hear from all of you and understand what it's going to take to ignite this effort across the board. And thank you so much, and I appreciate your time.
And now, a conversation on building a safer web. Please welcome Mark Ryland, Director of Solutions Architecture and Chief Architect of the Worldwide Public Sector Team at Amazon Web Services. Allison Miller is a Product Manager for Security and Privacy at Google. Susan Hennessy is a National Security Fellow at the Brookings Institution. And Eric Trexler is the Executive Director for Civilian and National Security Programs at McAfee. Back to lead the conversation, Steve Clemens.
Hi, folks. You guys are some of the biggest players in cyber out there. So I thought I would have a little bit of fun. Eric, if you were going to hack Google, how would you go ahead about doing it?
We talked about not talking.
Yeah. So I never coordinate on
I'd probably
content,
call
yeah.
some friends up
Yeah.
and ask them for
But
some
no,
advice.
but let's talk maybe about the kind of broad question of the stability and safety of systems, which I know many of you are thinking about how to create systemic trust, systemic safety, and anticipate what nefarious players are doing out there. And so I just want to get into the head. I mean, I've talked to Margaret Lowe, my colleague, before about this, that we ought to have a conference sometimes about bad guys, villains, narco gangs, and transnational, villains. I guess the big question is, what are the blind spots that we may have about thinking about nefarious players out there and what our vulnerabilities are?
Well, I think there's some rules that we need to bring up first and foremost. When you look at the adversary, the villain in your terminology, they have time on their side. They choose when to strike, where to strike, how to strike, how often to strike, and everything else. In addition to that, they don't play by the rules. They don't have to. And they only have to be right one time. So it's, the equation is really out of balance between the white hat and the black hat, or the attacker and the defender and the attacker.
So Alan, as you've just heard this in terms of what's going on with it, how do you basically develop a system and anticipate these kinds of things that you're trying to create systemic safety across your huge platform, which I and my colleagues depend upon?
Right, so there's sort of two different ways that we go about that. One is where we sit at Google, we have a lot of attacks coming in, and we can kind of train to detect these attack patterns.
Do you have like a
where they
number of attacks
manifest.
you sustain?
No. So the other system, the other route that we go is we actually go out and we're looking for the bad things. One of the infrastructures that I work with is known externally as safe browsing, and what we're doing is we're actually crawling the web, looking for things like malware and phishing that are really dangerous and intend to attack kind of everyday folks. And when we find those things, then we can figure out clever ways to route people away from them, like giving them a warning in their browser if they happen to surf in that direction. But what's happening is what happens with adversaries is they are able to adapt just as we try and adapt our systems. And so if you take an example, if you take something like phishing, for example, which is a pernicious issue that has kind of existed forever, and email and the web have just made it difficult. It used to be like spam. Do you guys remember the phishing campaigns? They were horrible. They didn't look like they would trick anyone, but they would go out en masse, and they were playing sort of the
And this
rule
was so
of
that
numbers.
people would click on a link?
Yes,
Yeah.
so phishing, someone would click on a link, and then it would impersonate a site that perhaps the person who received the email had an account on, like a bank or some sort of financial services. They're trying to steal that kind of password and login information so they could abuse someone's financial credentials or do something like identity theft. That used to be like spam, these mass campaigns. And spam is, I'm not going to say it's easy to find, but it's easier to find than something that is designed specifically for you to trick you. And so as the adversaries have shifted, now that we have to change how we play the game and kind of shift to adapt to what they're doing now, which is moving from mass campaigns to targeted campaigns. And that's a lot more difficult. It means we need to apply a lot of different tools
Allison,
to that.
did you have personal data that was compromised in the Equifax breach?
Did I?
Yeah.
Perhaps.
So when Equifax came out, and I went to the Equifax site, I was interested in this because I bought a house, would like to know how that looked. I found grammatical errors. I'm an editor. I found grammatical errors in the material and information on their website, and to go through it, you had to go through layers of clicked links. And I had to, I just had to ask you, what would you do? Given all you know, would you have gone through Equifax's site and clicked those links? Because I thought there was a risk that we were being fooled, and that there was some massive thing here that we were being, because all the things that my IT guy at The Atlantic has taught me, I violated in trying to get down to whether I had been, gone. I'm just interested because this is a world-class company, 143 million people's information in this place, and I'm just wondering, we just had an experiment in all the bad lessons, didn't we?
I think we're going to have a lot of lessons learned from this, yes, and we continue to learn new lessons learned every day.
Susan, would you have clicked on those links?
I would have. I mean, one of the things that I think Allison is being polite about is that Equifax did a really, really lousy job here. So not only did they allow the breach in the first place, but actually their response to it put their customers at additional risk, right? So it wasn't just that there was this sort of bad site that even people who are trying to be conscientious couldn't quite tell if it was safe or not. We want it to be easy for people to make good choices. It was also that the way that they designed their response opened up people to phishing attacks. There were all kinds of fake websites that were out there that instead of Equifax 2015, it was Equifax 2016, right? And actually did further compound the harms here. And so I do think that this is a wake up call, not just for the general public, but also potentially on the Hill, about whenever companies really are not being responsible in this space, either sort of on the front end of protection and on the back end, whether or not we need to be thinking about altering our laws to change sort of the ability of individual people who are harmed by these breaches to seek some kind of remedy.
And let's be honest, you
Yeah.
didn't even have to be an Equifax customer
Right.
to lose your data.
Which
You
is-
didn't even choose to work with them.
Right.
And you could still lose all of your personal data.
I think this is a really important point. Usually we've been thinking about this as customers that have particular relationships that they've chosen to enter into. I have a Gmail account. I made that choice. I agreed to a series of things. I chose Gmail among other choices. Now our data is held by companies where we're not really the customer, we're their product, and we have no ability to control or exercise those market forces in order to ask companies to themselves make better choices.
Mark, has Amazon Web been breached, hacked, penetrated?
Our platform is helped people get more secure. I mean, that's really I love coming on stage after Gus Hunt. I'm one of our great former customers at the CIA who helped procure a secret region for the intelligence community. And he had the vision, and other government leaders have the vision, and have realized that although cloud isn't a panacea, it's still, you just be very crude, you could say about 50% of the things that you normally have to worry about if you're running your own physical infrastructure are taken care of by very professional companies who have a laser focus on building highly secure systems. So it really reduces the kinds of things you need to worry about. You still have to do a good job, but cloud is a big, big step forward, and many, many customers are saying that. I mean, Tony Scott, the former CIO, just a year ago was saying, you should think of cloud providers as like a bank. You put your money in a bank, you don't keep it in a closet. So cloud is part of the moonshot that we need to all do together, because it provides the automation, the scale, the capabilities that are really, really hard to do on your own. So cloud is part of the
Do you
solution.
and Allison feel we're sort of like in an arms race to some degree with this? I was talking to a guy from Raytheon the other day who does a lot of national security-based things, and he said, with AI coming down and maybe what Will Hurd was talking about with quantum computing, we're going to get back to systems and algorithms that create layers of protection and response and sensitivity to things that we don't have necessarily broadly deployed now. So is this something I can begin to relax a little bit more about because of the technological advancement? And then I want you to tell me, what are the bad guys going to do after we get, AI and, smart algorithms?
You've got it, but you've got to remember the rules.
Wait, don't tell me yet. Yeah, go ahead.
Don't relax, but at least recognize that modern IT modernization understood broadly, which includes obviously increasing security posture, is going to really help. And when we work with customers who make those changes, even something as simple as just kind of lift and shift, people think, well, why would it be better to run an application that used to run on premises, run it in the cloud? The fact is the cloud provides a whole set of new metadata and information and controls around it. It creates kind of an envelope or wrapper around that. And so we have customers that say, look, I'm much more confident that same app running in the cloud.
Pretend you're trying to sell me, because I don't understand what that means. Okay. So you've got a wraparound and someplace in the cloud. How are your laws of gravity different than some of the things that we're seeing out here of penetrated
Think of it this
systems?
way, there's extra layers provided by the cloud itself, which give you more control over things like ingress, egress, understanding attack patterns. All that information is provided by the platform, even if you don't re-instrument or change the application that you've moved.
Economies of scale to defense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very bullish on cloud. I think that it's going to be great for enterprises because have you guys heard of the term the security poverty line? I
No.
need to give credit to Wendy Nather, but
Hashtag security poverty
the
line.
security poverty line is this idea that you need to spend a certain amount to get to that minimum bar of defense that a company would expect, for example. So if you sort of think about that, most enterprises, we hope, are above that, and cloud's really going to help make it easier for folks to get above that. But small businesses and individuals are probably all below that, is sort of the downside of that. So one of the reasons why I'm bullish on cloud and machine learning and some of the other advances in technology is that means that we can sort of automate these things as services and have them be more broadly available, as opposed to what we have now, which is a lot of companies making decisions about how to design their defenses and try and manage attacks coming from the outside on their own.
How are you going to take them on?
So machine learning, artificial intelligence, the cloud, I've got to be right one time, right? I can be right, I can work where I want to. Machine learning, when you're working with it, it's programmed by humans. There aren't enough humans. We can break the models, right? We can do data poisoning, overflow the model, and skew it. Think of it, I'll give you an example. We're pretty good at predicting weather these days. When humans are on top of the machine models, we're even better at predicting weather. Yet we still can't predict earthquakes. So I can tell you where a hurricane is going to hit, but I can't tell you when or where an earthquake is going to hit. Tesla, let's look at cars, right? We've got machine learning, artificial intelligence, they can self-drive. The equivalent I would give you to a cybersecurity world, because remember, I get to make the rules. Your car's going down, it understands there's a car on your right, a car on your left, coming up in a 55-mile-per-hour speed zone. All of a sudden, I move the road over here. What does the car do? It's not programmed for it. The machine can't handle it. We will be much better with machine learning and artificial intelligence. It is not a silver bullet, though.
Should we all go back to cash? I mean, I just worry.
Slow us down a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that did. But
I'm sorry.
you're raising interesting points. Let me raise another kind of, before I go to Susan, and who's your co-editor of the Lawfare blog?
I'm the managing.
Managing editor. So thank you for the Lawfare blog. It's just one of the great reservoirs of smart thinking, a lot of issues. As I've talked to friends at Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and others, one of the things that's not discussed enough, I think, are the national rules, national industrial agendas of governments, that basically have legal authority over the server farms where they may be there. So we talk about cloud as if it's detached from everything, but the fact is there are these large server farms that the cloud exists in, and there are national rules that sometimes do this. And I know that there are cases in Brazil right now where criminal cases are trying to sort of force a Microsoft or force a Google to basically disclose information from accounts. So how do you deal with these kind of old world problems where maybe a crime, a criminal case, is pretty closely affiliated with the national economic interests of that country?
Everybody's trying, so the industry in general is taking the view that we're not going to build special features just to enable access.
Right.
And moreover, we're building more and more features that enable, by the use of cryptography, such that the provider can't access the customer data.
Right.
So if you combine those two trends, you'll see, I think, a positive outcome, which is, privacy and security for all. And government, obviously we have to comply with all the laws of the countries where we operate.
Right.
By the way, that's a very generic point. Often it's misunderstood as like, oh, the Patriot Act is the problem and everything else is fine. No, it's a general problem around the globe. There's actually more due process in the US than a lot of other countries on these topics. But if you combine the powers of these global platforms where I can place my data in some far distant region where potentially the government I care about has actually no jurisdiction, no direct jurisdiction, along with the security controls and the encryption and the ability to manage my own keys and manage when and how data gets decrypted. It's overall, I think, a very powerful story. But these issues will, they'll continue to percolate along.
Allison, your thoughts on this? How do you deal with those issues?
Well, I'm going to give a huge plug to our new transparency report. We just launched a redesign, which is sort of a place where we're able to at least disclose how we're interacting with governments and law enforcement on the one hand. And on the other hand, we actually are sort of unique in that we provide insights into what we're seeing in the ecosystem related to things like phishing and malware attacks that live on the web. But I actually kind of wanted to go back to the point that you made where I think it's attackers only need to get it right once, which I think is something that we've been talking about that for a while, and certainly when an attacker is fully successful and they get root and they succeed in a breach, it's awful. But I think that part of what we need to do, since there are no silver bullets, is realize that some of these products that we're designing, we need to design them to have incremental failures in a more elegant way, meaning, for example, something like a phishing attack. If you think that the attacker only needs to succeed once, but they need to design, let's say, an email, it needs to show up in an inbox, a user needs to click on it, and then potentially enter credentials. That's actually a lot of steps that have to go through.
Is that what John Podesta did?
And if you are defending from, if you're trying to defend from an attack like that, you have multiple points at which you can put defenses. You can try and figure out how not to deliver that email. You can try and figure out how to flag the email as being unusual in some way. If someone clicks on the email, perhaps you can warn them in their browser. And then the last step, if the user has opted into something additional like two-factor authentication or something like security key, then giving up the credentials doesn't result in the harm. So I feel like as we are sort of building this technology, trying to figure out how to understand how things can fail along the way, but we can still do things to reduce the harm.
Part of the problem has been
Absolutely
lack of
agree.
compartmentalization. So every, we
Right.
have way too many systems where, a large number of users, so not following least privilege model, which is only the absolute minimum number of users should have access to the data. We don't follow that model, and then we have these huge data pools where if you can get in, you get everything. And then we have to change that. We have to do what Gus was saying, microsegmentation, compartmentalization. We can now build, storage is so cheap that you should never delete anything. There shouldn't even be a delete feature of your system. You should only accumulate data, and therefore, if an attacker gets in and gets my privileges, I can't delete anything, so they can't delete anything. So, and essentially databases are more and more designed essentially as log structured things where you simply add things to the log.
I was going to try and make this an optimistic sounding panel, but the idea
Well-
of not being able to delete anything is scary. But real quick, Susan, on the broad issue of the legal frameworks in which all of this is happening, what do you think are some of the missing pieces? I was just talking about the international one because it just happens to be something I've learned a little bit about as one of the frustrations that sort of large platform enterprises are facing that deal with essentially what used to be old kind of national corporate espionage trying to penetrate. What do you sort of look at as the legal framework deficits that we're not talking about and should?
So I think there's a lot of them. That, one of the biggest ones is it sort of gets at this exact issue of sovereignty. We're asking judges, state and federal judges, to make a decision about where data actually exists and what law should apply to that data. That's a really, really complex question to answer, and we just from the sort of the outset lack the framework and lack the way that we should be thinking about that. And even if we could sort of, there are various theories on, we should think about it this way, and there are legal arguments. Lawyers go to court and duke it out, but we actually need to come up with a model that is flexible enough to accommodate lots and lots of technological changes over time, and the interests of various sovereigns. The United States likes to sort of say, we built the internet, and so we're going to set the rules for it. Now we're saying that we have sort of co-equal players. There are other people at the table that also have their own, legitimate assertion of rights over their data, the data of their sovereigns and their citizens. And so these are not small questions. These are not questions where, we just need to pass a little law. These are sort of massive structural questions that is going to infect not just data breach law, but actually every single part of sort of the US legal system by the time we've sort of undergone this
Susan,
revolution.
do you think we should trust Amazon Web Services, Google, and McAfee to create the next generation safe system on their own, or do you think it requires regulation, direction, and requirements that federal authorities should be laying out?
I think the threshold question we need to ask is, what job do we expect the government to do in this space, and what job do we expect the private sector to do in this space? We have certain things that we only let government actors do. Only a police officer gets to detain you, right? Sort of the government has a monopoly over certain types of activity because we've decided, hey, we don't want the private sector doing this. We want to sort of reserve this to a hyper-regulated space. We have not made some of those important decisions sort of in cyberspace, essentially. So those are the kinds of, the government hasn't made those decisions yet. So the law carves out a lot of activity really for the government to do, and had told companies, we don't want you hacking back. We don't want you engaging in violations of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and other laws that are supposed to prevent bad actors. And at the same time, the government is not resourced, either sort of technologically or financially, to step into that sort of that space and actually do that defense there. So it's sort of like telling a company, you can't hire security guards, and we can't afford to send police officers to you. And so we're going to have to make those decisions and then resource there. If the answer here is no, private companies are better in this space, then we are going to need to pull back the laws in some areas while sort of shoring them up in others to ensure that consumers are ultimately being protected.
And just very quickly, you go first, but I want to just ask very, very quickly, the three of you, that do you feel, because you're not just your companies, you're dealing with people using your services, and we've been talking a little bit about cyber health and developing a healthier ecosystem. Is it helpful or hurtful to you to see greater federal guidelines, or what the DoD just did in issuing standards for their contract? Do you need bench posts out there other than what you guys are doing? I mean, in other words, do you invite greater regulation in this space?
We believe in incentive-based benefits, tax benefits, things like that. We also believe strongly in working with the government. We are better together. Our tagline at McAfee is "Together is Power." There is no one company, individual, or government agency that is going to solve this problem or even make great strides against it without working with others. It's one of the reasons we came out with we were a founding member of the the Cyber Threat Alliance.
Right.
Working
Allison?
together.
Allison?
Well, I can't speak entirely to that question, but I will say
How about a part of the question?
from where I sit, we're investing a lot in trying to make the web ecosystem safer, and it's inspiring, and I think that it's
Does it
helpful.
feel safer
and
to
there's
you?
a lot of other players that we can learn more from.
But
Does it
just
feel
over time, does it feel
safer?
safer to you? Like I started this forum today saying, keep doing these events. It just seems like we're more and more fragile. There's more and more trauma. There are more and more issues. And I want to get down to sort of giving somebody a lot of power to fix it, but that's not going to happen. But does it feel safer to you?
I feel safer knowing what I know about how the systems work. But again, the threat model keeps changing. Adversaries keep changing how they operate. I'm very aware.
Mark?
One of the things that we see is government, there's an indirect form of regulation by the acquisition rules. So one of the ways governments have operated over the years is not to say you must do X, but rather if you don't do X, we won't buy from you. And I think that's actually been a pretty good balance for a lot of vendors. So for example, one of the most rigorous security and compliance regimes that we operate under, that Google and others operate under, is the FedRAMP regime. So it's very rigorous. Tons and tons of work goes into preparing, detailed documentation, lots of evidence about how do you build your system, how secure are they, how do you operate them, and then a frequent re-auditing process, okay? We don't need to do that because we could sell to other entities without that certification.
Right.
But the federal government requires it. Guess what? Banks love it, other countries love it, other players in the market like the fact that we operate under a rigorous regime which is voluntary in the sense that we don't have to sell to the government, but it's essentially required to be successful in government business. So that, I think, is provided a pretty good balance as opposed to direct
two-finger,
regulation.
Susan?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of, everyone's, I think, dutifully representing legitimate, corporate interests here. I think if any of us looking at the landscape can see that we're essentially in a crisis point right now. And so I do think it's fair to say whatever has been done in the past, it's not working anymore. And so as much as obviously voluntary sort of models and cooperation, we're optimistic that those might work. At the end of the day, whenever we see persistent failures, persistent market failures, the inability to correct that activity, that is the place in which we do need governments to step in and impose regulatory laws.
Okay, we have time for a question here. Yes, right here. She'll hold the mic for you.
Stand up.
How are you? Tell us who you are.
I'm Peter Pennington. I'm an independent person, and I have my data in the cloud up there somewhere. Don't worry about it. But for me to get into the cloud is almost as simple as going, bing bong, I'm the Avon lady. I have a password. I can make that password complicated with big letters, small letters, numbers, and squiggly bits, which then means I have to write it down because I've got to remember the damn thing.
Right.
What are we doing about passwords?
And I just want to say that the Atlantic, I don't know if I'm issuing trade secrets, just forced me yesterday to get into my system to a 14-letter long, multiple character, nothing like anything I've ever done in history before. Margaret, did you have to do that? I did not. Oh, wait, it's coming. It's coming. And it's hard. And so now, yeah, so, but we this is something we're all dealing with. And I was asking myself, I guess I had a dream last night anticipating this, is when do we go from the 14-letter long requirement to a 56-letter long requirement, for passwords? And so, Allison, I know you know the answer to this.
Yes.
Yeah, you are
Thank you so much for asking this question. Number one, I love my password manager, my password concierge, because it not only remembers my passwords for me, it generates them for me.
Oh.
It makes it very, and a password manager, which conveniently I think there's one built into the Chrome browser, but there's plenty of choices out there. Is that if, for example, I mistakenly clicked on a phishing link, the password manager is smart and realizes, oh, that is actually not your Gmail that is asking for your password, and if it's something I haven't logged into, it won't allow me to sort of fill it in. So that's one. That's because I think there's a long tail of passwords. But the golden shining opportunity here, too, is to try and get into two-factor authentication, whether you're using like a security key, which those are great, or if you're using something like SMS-based or app-based. Those are fantastic
Mark, Eric, quick
alternatives.
thoughts?
Yeah, so NIST just issued a news technical paper not many months ago saying that passwords are dead. Essentially, it's that we've tried and failed to secure things with passwords, so we need to move on and figure out other solutions. So it's going to be things like adaptive authentication. So Google systems, our systems are very smart about, hey, you've never logged in from this IP range before. We're going to be more aggressive in challenging you. Multi-factor is going to be a force here. And use passphrases, by the way. Don't use long gobbledygook password. If you need a long password, use a phrase. Their entropy is about the same. There's no way that no one's going to guess a little poem or something that you type in, right? So that's one little tip.
Right.
But yeah, passwords are, it's funny because we're just like tightening down on passwords right around the time the experts are saying, you know what, this isn't
So your
working.
real answer to him is it's going to get much, much harder. Yeah, and Eric?
We fully agree. I mean, the password is one of the things that as an individual you control it well.
Susan, I know we're out of time, but I want to ask you to go back to this gentleman's comment a minute ago about responsible encryption, because you've written about lawful hacking. Are they the same thing?
I guess maybe they're opposite. I'm not entirely sure what sort of responsible encryption.
I think
was
responsible
intended.
encryption meant that somebody's giving the keys to the kingdom to the government.
Right. So
Right?
this is one of sort of the core challenges is how do we want to balance network security with other forms of security? It's an area in which we're going to have to look for trade-offs and balances. Lawful hacking. There are other sort of opportunity spaces here. It's going to require a lot of voluntary cooperation with the private sector, a lot of conversations, and at the end of the day, it's going to require difficult choices in which the government goes to the people and says, we can do this or we can do this, and you have to make a choice. So that hard choice is maybe a little bit further off in the distance, but I think ultimately it's coming.
Mark Ryland, Amazon Web Services, Allison Miller, Google, Susan Hennessy, Brookings, and Eric Trexler with McAfee. Thank you all very much. Really
Thank you.
Next up, for a conversation on protecting critical infrastructure, please welcome the Chief Information Security Officer at New York Presbyterian Hospital, Jennings Oskey, and Scott Aronson, the Executive Director of Security and Business Continuity at Edison Electric Institute. And here to lead the conversation is Atlantic Live contributor Kathleen Koch.
So Scott, I know you're excited. We're going to start out right out of the gate talking about North Korea.
Perfect.
And spearfishing. NBC reported this week that they have been doing more and more of this spearfishing. And basically these are emails where they're trying to plant malware into the computer networks of these companies, these electric power companies. Can you talk to us about who they were targeting? Did the companies, were they aware of this? When did they find out? And really, how concerned are they and are you about what's happening?
So I never want to be dismissive about a particular threat or about a threat actor, but I can simply say that this is something that happens all the time. Now, some people may gasp and, oh my
Is that
God.
supposed to make us feel better?
Right, no, that part shouldn't make you feel better, but what should is that it does happen all the time, and at least to this point, there has never been a attack on U.S. Electric infrastructure that has an impact on our ability to actually operate the grid. So while this happens all the time, I think our preparedness really does speak for itself. Now that said, that's cold comfort, because if the adversary has to be right just once, and we have to be right 100% of the time, we need to be preparing for that eventuality when there is a successful attack. And I can assure you that as a sector, that's something that we focus a lot on. I like to talk about the boom continuum. Left of boom and right of boom, before a bad thing happens, after a bad thing happens. So left of boom, you prepare, you protect, you detect, you defend. But you also have to look right of boom at the ability to respond and recover. And that is something that we as a sector focus as much, if not more attention on as we continue to prepare our systems to fight back against these advanced persistent threats that nation-state actors can perpetrate.
No, I understand in this spearfishing, they were not successful. At least that's what's being reported now. But this comes right on the heels of the revelation last month about the attacks by hackers, apparently, supposedly connected with the Russian government. And this has been going on since 2015 and actually targeting the control systems, and they did get in. So I mean, are we getting closer to boom? And how prepared really are you to fight this off?
So you're speaking of...
These are hostile nation states,
They
right?
are. And, there's the old mutually assured destruction framework. And so what's wonderful about advanced persistent threat from nation states is geopolitics, our capabilities, offensive capabilities as the U.S. military are a good deterrent. But another way that you deter, so one way you deter is that there is a response to the attack. That is fully a government responsibility, and I am very confident in the NSA and the DoD and the other three-letter agencies that do what they do really, really well here in the United States. The other way you deter is that the attack does not have the intended effect. So if I am a threat actor, well, gosh, why am I going to spend all of this time and resources and money to perpetrate an attack that may not have the intended consequence? So when we look at Ukraine, for example, right, which is where some threat actors have been practicing their wares.
And there has been no response, really, no deterrent.
So these are my favorite kind of attacks because they are attacks that happen someplace else, but that we can learn from here, and we are. So what we have seen, one of the interesting things about the Ukraine attack at the end of 2015 is 225,000 people lost power for 6 hours. That's a bad day for those 3 electric companies in Ukraine that were attacked, but it's not exactly catastrophic for their national or economic security. They were able to start operating their systems again in a degraded state, but without that digital infrastructure. So one of the things that we are learning from incidents overseas is what would we do here? Could we operate the grid in a degraded state? Could we operate it without that digital overlay? And the answer is largely yes. It would be inefficient. Customers wouldn't have the control that they're used to having. Maybe we wouldn't be billing, but we would be able to keep the lights on. And if we're talking about this in terms of national security, that needs to be, that is a good outcome.
Jennings, when it comes to hospitals, I think most of us think back to WannaCry, to the Petya ransomware attacks back in May and June that really spread worldwide, and in some cases, particularly in Great Britain, really crippled hundreds of hospitals, not so many here in the United States. Talk to us about what was happening in your hospital, New York Presbyterian, as those attacks were underway, and how did you protect your hospital and your patients' information, their records, et cetera?
Well, so our hospital has been basically preparing for these kind of attacks for a couple of years now. I've been with the hospital since 2015, and our leadership has come to view security as an existential threat to the hospital. The way we think of it is that there could be an event, a terrorist event in New York City that takes out a single hospital or a big part of Manhattan, but we'd still be up and operational in some of the boroughs of New York City, other parts of Manhattan. But something like WannaCry could take down the entire hospital system, and that would mean that 50,000 employees couldn't treat patients and things of that nature. So we've been preparing, we've been implementing advanced cyber technologies for years, and that's really why it didn't have the impact on us that it did on some of the other entities. And
so are you 100% safe there?
No, we're not 100% safe, and I don't think anyone would say they're, in any industry, 100% safe from any cyber threat. What I would say, in fact, is that what keeps me awake at night is the issues we have with securing medical devices, which are vulnerable to these kind of attacks. And a medical device is basically something like an infusion pump, or an infusion pump is a device that actually controls liquid substances that go into a patient's body. It could be drugs, could be nutrients. There's other devices that are radiology related. They have Windows operating systems, and we struggle to patch these. And patching is really critical to preventing this kind of attack.
Why is it so hard to patch them?
Well, it's hard to patch because there's a couple of reasons. One is that the device manufacturers actually they themselves do the patching quite often. Hospitals don't patch some of these devices like the way we do other servers, like our EHR servers. And so we rely upon this medical device manufacturer patching, and they're slow. They will claim that the FDA prevents them from patching, which is not true. That's actually just entirely wrong. The FDA has been very clear that security patching can occur. Additionally, sometimes patching can't happen remotely, so you have to do it, what we call sneaker net, where you walk up with a USB flash drive from, PC to PC or server to server and patch. And so
doesn't sound very efficient.
It isn't. And the medical device manufacturers haven't made security part of their product life cycle.
How do we change that?
That's a good question. over the past few months, I've been on a bit of a roadshow meeting with people from reps from the House Energy and Commerce Committee, meeting with medical device manufacturers, and basically trying to engage them in a conversation, trying to get them to care about this. At the same time, I'm working with hospitals around the country on kind of a grassroots movement where we're going to use our purchasing power collectively to force vendors to care about this. We're going to refuse to let vendors sell to us if they won't change their practices. And that's going to be a challenge because these devices save lives. They're not new devices, and we know that they're not going to be secure on day one, so the vendors are going to have to come up with mitigation strategies. But that's the approach we're going to try and take, and maybe at some point, maybe legislation will happen that actually mandates security that's necessary for our critical infrastructure.
Now, Scott and Jennings, most experts acknowledge that in both your fields, in healthcare and the electric power sectors, there is antiquated equipment, there is technology that doesn't meet the latest cybersecurity standards. I heard one expert describe it as us having an overdependence on undependable things. So if you could each play a role right now in designing a comprehensive cybersecurity standard for your industry, what would you fix first?
So I'm going to answer that question kind of holistically. So you're talking about an overdependence on undependable devices and some of the things that Jennings was just saying I completely agree with in our sector as well. So first of all, standards to me they're useful. They create a floor. They are a regulatory approach. The electric power sector is one of the few that has mandatory and enforceable standards for cyber and physical security. Hey, that's great. But if you look at security as a check-the-box exercise, all right, I've done X, Y, and Z, I'm secure. No, you're complacent. And in fact, it's worse because you have telegraphed what your security profile is. The really simple way to put it is if I tell you, you've got to put a 10-foot fence around everything, the adversary is just bringing a 12-foot ladder. So
what do we do?
So standards by themselves are useful to, I want to make them bring that ladder, but it's not an end-all be-all. Back to my original point of we've got to be right 100% of the time and the adversary has to be right once. I think what we need is more of a mandate, and part of what we can do with our market power is to force some of our vendors to not just provide us with secure devices, but the capability, especially in our sector, I'm not sure how this works in Jennings, to be able to operate in a degraded state. I'll tell a really quick anecdote without naming names. We were talking to an enormous multinational manufacturer, brought a bunch of chief information security officers from companies in the electric power sector, and this particular provider was saying, we're going to be the industrial internet, we're going to digitize everything, it's going to be great. And the CISO sitting around the table said, hey, that's great, we love the efficiency, we love the ability to control our systems remotely, but do we have the capacity to operate manually? Can we go back to the 1960s? We operated the electric grid for the better part of the 20th century without digital infrastructure. A great defense would be the ability to do that again. And so that's something that I think our sector is going to continually pursue. All of the digital overlay wonderful, all the efficiency is wonderful, but also the capacity to operate degraded.
Jennings, I'd like you to answer that briefly before we go to questions, but also I do think it's fascinating to point out that the healthcare industry makes up, it's the 6th largest industry in our US economy, but you have become the #1 target for cyber crime. So what would you change, and in particular at a time when only 15% of hospitals actually have a cyber expert on staff, and here you are, this huge target?
Yeah, so I think you hit the nail on the head. The biggest change that healthcare needs to make is to invest in cybersecurity professionals and then cyber technologies that have been deployed in other industry verticals. Healthcare, I think, was hindered by the HIPAA security rule that went into effect in 2005.
Hindered how so? I thought that was protecting all of us and our privacy.
Well, that's exactly it. It really, the security standards that were that are enforced by that rule are really more about protecting privacy, and they're not geared towards cyber risk. Now, a security professional like me knows how to read those and extend those to other industry-agnostic security standards. So there's standards from the Center for Internet Security, et cetera, et cetera. We adopt those, we use those to build our security program, but it's because I'm a trained expert who knows how to do this, and unfortunately, too many hospitals don't have this, and they're also lacking basic security controls like two-factor authentication. I'm floored by how many security officers I talk to who are at hospitals, and their leadership's resisting because it'll be an impediment to patient care, and things like that. And I'm glad to say that I work at an institution that recognizes security as an existential threat, but unfortunately, healthcare hasn't realized that, and
How do we change that?
Well, I think there's a couple things. I mean, one, I think the events that have happened over the past year with WannaCry and NotPetya have really raised the alarm bells, so to speak, across healthcare. I know that the CEO of my hospital system is actually really active in trying to get hospitals to care about this, and I think the federal government could play a role if it actually would take a more proactive glass half full messaging around this, and we've talked
You
about
need regulation.
No, I don't think regulation is the answer. I actually think bringing people together, education, I think the government can do things and can facilitate things. And just in terms of my role, I try to certainly work with my peers around the country and share best practices. So I think that the trend is turning positive, but healthcare has a way to go.
All right, well, let's go to the audience. So do we have mic runners or do we have, excellent, right in the front here? And if you would just stand up, please, and identify yourself so we know who's asking the question. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Li Yang. Thanks for your presentation. I think that cyber is some sort of very scary to a lot of people, and we are thinking about government supposed to protect all the people. And we think about government before is always sloppy and they don't solve any problem. And now we have cyber, and if they have a private contractor or cooperation with corporations, and if a corporation and a contractor working on the wrong side of the well-being of the general public, so how are we going to solve that and ask the government and corporation or contractor really think about the people's benefit? So we can really benefit the general public rather than going backward to the wild war.
So I really appreciate that question. I'll jump on it first because it dovetails a little bit off of what Jennings was saying. Government and industry absolutely have a role to play together. And whatever your vision of government's abilities and industry's motivations are, I'll talk about it this way. Government, people like to say government is incompetent in this. No. I mean, our national security agencies, our intelligence community, the Department of Homeland Security recognize, I'll use Jennings' words, that this is an existential threat. And when you then look at the private sector, again, Jennings used the word existential threat. It's something that our sector views as existential as well. There's two ways to look at it. One is the cynical way. If our equipment isn't spinning, we're not making money. So we have every incentive to protect our systems. The other is we live and work in the communities that we serve. So it's a more patriotic kind of view that we have a responsibility to the life, health, and safety of Americans. We have a role in national economic security. And I used the deterrence example. Industry has a role. We have to make sure the attacks don't have certain consequences. Government has a role. They have the responsibility to hack back. But there are other shared responsibilities, intelligence gathering, having a standing army, law enforcement responsibilities. The private sector simply doesn't have that. So if we are not working together, we are failing our public and our customers. And I think that's something that increasingly, and once again, dovetailing off something Jennings said, CEOs get that. I'm privileged to serve not just at EEI, but I serve as the secretary for the Electric Sector Coordinating Council, and that brings together CEOs from all segments of the industry across North America. It is a North American grid to work at the highest levels of government, and I can tell you that the initiatives that have come out of that collaboration have been invaluable, and I can also tell you that when the CEOs care about something, it's amazing how the rest of the enterprise does. So just as it is for Jennings, it is a priority for the Chief Information Security Officer because they know the CEO has their back, is giving them the resources that they need, and that this is something that they view as a moral responsibility, as a patriotic responsibility, and as a fiduciary responsibility.
Jennings, do you want to take a crack at it? Or?
Well, I'll just comment. You mentioned contractors, and contractors exist in all aspects of IT in every industry vertical. And we were aware of some of the breaches and issues caused by contractors, and there are some best practices that can be used to make sure that contractors can't exfiltrate data. Unfortunately, they're not being implemented. And
why not?
Well, companies are lazy and security is hard. And it's something that it takes commitment, and it takes someone realizing there's an ethical obligation to their customers and to their shareholders if they're publicly traded, and ultimately it's something groups and organizations have to be committed to, but they're not. We're seeing that with some of the things that have been announced for the past few weeks. It's just unfortunate that people aren't investing in this.
Another question? Right, back here.
Hi, good morning. My name is Erin Dumbacher. I'm with the Nuclear Threat Initiative. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you internally and when you collaborate or cooperate with other entities, how do you overcome the fact that security is often seen as a cost center for an organization? How do you make that argument with the CEO who's not yet listening? Or how do you make that argument with a competitor that you should work together?
Probably easier for me to answer that question, so I'll let you think for a second. In our sector, we all operate one big machine with thousands of owners and operators. So the electric grid is one big machine, and we're competitive in some regards, but in others we have to collaborate. So I think that's one aspect of it. And then going back to what the previous answer, whether you believe it or not, we do really believe in our responsibility to our customers and to the local community, and we also recognize that we are critical to other sectors. But it is also an existential threat from a financial standpoint that if our equipment is devastated, we will lose that company. So our CEOs really get that responsibility both on the economic side as well as on the other. And I'll take an opportunity just to answer it one slightly different way across sectors. Everybody looks at the electric sector as the most critical. If we don't have water, we can't generate steam or cool our systems. If we don't have telecommunications, we can't operate. If we don't have transportation and pipelines, we can't move fuel. If we don't have financial services, we can't have access to capital markets, we can't trade our products. So there are a lot of ways to impact the electric sector without attacking the electric sector. So increasingly, our motivation is to work across sectors, north-south, industry and government, but east-west across critical sectors.
Jennings, I'll give you the last word.
Well, I need about another week to think about that for healthcare. No, but seriously, I have the good fortune of meeting with our CEO, Chief Operating Officer, and General Counsel like every 2 weeks to talk about security, what we're doing, our progress. Our two primary business partners are the Columbia University and Cornell University. Their leadership gets it as well. Unfortunately, many of our business partners are still coming up to speed. And so, one thing we've tried to do is really change the messaging from being focused on privacy and compliance to being really focused on the integrity and availability of the medical record, And I can tell stories about, as an example, one time where there was a hospital that I know of, they thought their blood bank system was compromised, and they were worried that blood values had been changed and that could lead to a patient dying. You tell stories like that to a hospital CEO, they get it. But that message then needs to trickle down to the chiefs of departments. And so in healthcare, this messaging is really nascent, unfortunately, and that's why we're seeing some of the situations that are happening with WannaCry and Petya impacting hospitals. But I think the tide is turning just in the sense that, every time I reach out, those conversations are finally starting to be easy for the first time, except with medical device manufacturers. So.
A lot of work to be done. I don't know that I'm reassured, but thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Scott Aronson, Jennings Oskey. Thank you very much. Great.
Next, a look at how universities are training a new generation of cyber leaders. Please welcome to the stage Cameron Peters, a student at George Washington University's cybersecurity program, and the director of that GW program, Professor Scott White. And Michael Hicks is a professor of computer science at the University of Maryland and founding director of the Maryland Cybersecurity Center. To lead the conversation, Kathleen Koch.
Yeah, I think what was going on was
so this is
out of control in China. In other words, you had a lot of cutout actors, third-party contractors, and sort of had some affiliation with the government. And I don't think the central government even knew what a lot of these people were doing, and they basically hacked anything they could. Or you can share it. And I think what got raised more and more as an issue and became.
I just have this thing called C Cleaner or something, and it says the findings are significant because if it's been attributed to China, that would be that. So, yes, we'll get into all that. But again, respond to each other. Don't wait for me.
Yeah, right.
Did we get that? We got it. All right, I'm back.
Right.
As I was saying, I don't know if you were here for the congressman's interview first thing this morning, Congressman Hurd, but he said the government, when it comes to cybersecurity, is never never going to compete with the private sector. How hard do you find it to persuade students to resist the allure of Silicon Valley, working on a startup, and instead really, join the cybersecurity workforce? Talk to us about how difficult that is, and what are universities like yours doing to help students really understand the value and the importance of this field?
Sure. I think from my perspective, students will enter the field somewhere. They're not going to spend this amount of time and money and heading in a career path if they're not interested. So, I turn to my government colleagues and I'll say, you have to find a new model of incentivizing these young people to come to you. You're always going to get those people who believe in God and country who are going to go to work for the government because they want to. But inevitably, you're going to get a whole swath of students out there who are going to look to the private sector. So the two things have to occur. Either the government has to start with those connections to our private sector colleagues, or they're going to have to incentivize young people to come to them. And the promotion based on time served model may have worked in the past, but not in today's young consumer.
Does the government need to loosen up a little bit, shall we say? Steve earlier this morning was describing, the young student with a couple of piercings and, in his sloppy T-shirt, sleeping in, maybe he's got a few traffic tickets or other, brushes with the law. And so when it comes to cybersecurity, so often, certainly in the federal government, no, need not apply.
Right. I think, the Secret Service had this very issue with marijuana, where they've actually changed it now. It's not use, but it's experiment. If you experimented, we'll live with that. So I think we have to move. I think there's obviously security concerns are imperative. And there's a large difference between getting a motor vehicle violation as opposed to a substantial drug or some other type of felonious crime. So I think, government, I think you have to be cognizant of today's young people, and they're viewing the world differently. But ultimately, security and making sure you're bringing in someone that can receive a security clearance and is not going to be a threat is the important element.
Mike, is part of the problem that enough young people just aren't coming out of high school and looking at college and being interested in a STEM career? How challenging is it today to get young people excited about careers in cybersecurity? How do you inspire in them the same passion that you have about the field?
So at the University of Maryland, actually it's not a challenge at all. We have the largest computer science undergraduate program in the country. We have about 3,100 undergrads in CS, so the entire College Park campus is about 28,000 students, so we're a huge part of the entire university. And many of those students end up working for companies or working for the government doing security work. So I think that the interest in technology, the interest in science is there, and students want to be a part of the vanguard of making and reshaping our society to use technology more, and many of them are very intrigued and interested in security as well.
So you don't find any challenge at all?
We find the challenge in keeping up with all of the students that we have. It's quite a challenge to keep them interested, keep them trained, get them to come to College Park and pursue their degrees here at our modest state institution rather than go off to some fancy place somewhere else. And I think we're doing a pretty great job.
Well, speaking of the students, we have two here in Bronx. Thank you for joining us. DC traffic is the worst, is it not?
Yeah, Metro was backed up and everything too, but I was able to make it.
So when it comes to cybersecurity, you're both pursuing cybersecurity degrees. There are some who say, as we look down the road, if there ever is a World War III, that it will be a cyber war. Would you say that, is that intimidating or is that exciting to you to know that you might someday be, a warrior, a cyber warrior on the front lines?
Well, it's both. It's both exciting because, you're not just sitting behind a computer doing something that has no meaning. It actually has meaning to it. And there's really an effect to it, like the Ukrainian power grid attack. That's an excellent example of something that was cyber-based that had a real tangible effect on people's, I think it was hundreds of thousands of people's lives. They just lost the power like that. And you've got other things like what was it?
Georgia
Yeah. There was that, I'm just trying, it was OPM, that's what I'm trying to remember. And
Was that what inspired you to get into cybersecurity? Did I read
that's
that?
part of it, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, just, you see all these attacks going on, especially with OPM. It's this organization you expect that has security in place. And it's like, how did that happen? How did you lose track of all that data, especially when, you know, it's such sensitive data, background checks, stuff like that. And that's just exciting to me because I want to be able to help protect that data. And it seems almost like a challenge. You have all these adversaries, be it cyber criminals or even state actors, and they really want to get a hold of that. And to sort of have that challenge is just, it's something that excites me.
Bronx?
Yeah, so for me, on the defense side, so that would be something which I would be feeling like, okay, you know, coming out of high school, joining the military was something I had considered. So if I could do something in which, you know, I'm defending systems on the cyber side of things, as far as with the cyber war in North Korea and preventing, you know, nuclear winter and everything, that would be something I would be interested in doing. I know recently, a couple of years back, the Israeli and, you know, United States, they coordinated together in an effort to decentralize or diffuse some of Iran's centrifuges with the Stuxnet virus and everything. And everyone's, you know, doing it, trying to get into everybody's things. Like recently, Kaspersky, they were caught by the Israelis spying on the U.S., in which the U.S. was spying on, you know, everybody else, basically. But yeah, that's...
So you see this as another way of protecting and serving your country.
To me.
Scott and Mike, technology, as we all know, is constantly evolving. I mean, it seems like as soon as you get a new device, within 5 or 6 months, a better one has come out with vastly, you know, improved features. In the classroom, when you're teaching cybersecurity, how do you make sure that what you're teaching also doesn't quickly become obsolete?
Well, I'm fortunate in that, well, I could say I'm fortunate. The college I'm in, the College of Professional Studies, the great majority of the academics are industry professionals. So I have the advantage of being able to go out and get people that are currently working directly in that field. I may only bring them in for 1 semester of teaching, but I have that advantage of going out and grabbing people that are working right now today in that area. So they often are able to bring into the classroom exactly what they were doing that day, and you know, use that as the basis of their lecture. So that's a real benefit to my program at GW.
Mike?
I would say that the challenge that we as university professors face all the time is being able to teach useful skills, but also to teach students how to think, how to take those skills and generalize them and adapt them. Things that I learned when I was an undergraduate, many of them still have value today, but many of the details are different. So especially in a computer science curriculum like the one that we have, it's important for students to understand that when they build software, their software is on the front lines. It is, as an example, the WannaCry ransomware attack was due to a software vulnerability that was exploited. The most recent Equifax breach was due, once again, to a software vulnerability that was exploited and much data was stolen. And so even if you aren't thinking that you're a cybersecurity person, if you're writing software, you are. And so we need to provide general, reusable skills to help them think about, okay, I can't trust all of the input I'm receiving. I can't trust all of the data that's coming in. I can't trust the network my data is going across. Given that reality, how do I write my systems? How do I build my code? How do I configure things properly? And those lessons of approaching a system, thinking about its threats, thinking about how to build it to diffuse those threats are general lessons that can evolve as the technology evolves. At least that's the message we try to put across.
How are you addressing quantum computing?
We were just talking about that. So quantum computing is interesting. I guess you're referring to the fact that cryptography can potentially be broken more easily with a quantum computer than with a so-called classical computer. So at Maryland, we have a pretty sophisticated quantum computing research center that is in partnership with NIST. It's one of the best centers. It's called JQI, Joint Quantum Institute. It's one of the best in the country. And so people are thinking about exactly that problem of what is the landscape of future, not just quantum computation, but quantum cryptography, quantum communication, and how can we both exploit those capabilities for our advantage while also defend against them? So I would say it's very much cutting edge research to be thinking about these questions.
Scott.
No, I concur. You know, the interesting thing about the field, though, which I enjoy, is the fact that it's so multidisciplinary. My colleague is in a CS. My program is adaptive technology. So, and then there's our friends in computer engineering as well. So when you look at the vastness of the discipline, it can bring in so many different people. Myself, I was saying earlier, I don't hold a degree in any technology. I'm a clinical criminologist. I do human factor analysis of how people behave on computers and who are adversaries and deconstructing them. So one of the great joys that we have in this industry is that we can bring in a vast array of different professionals adding to this, collectively, to this discipline. So as I say, my students are probably looking at the adaptive nature of it. How do we take existing technologies today and adapt them to the real world problems that we're facing? And that's one of the skill sets that my students get, is being able to analyze the environment and then be able to apply a strategy, especially in business, where we're moving constantly at breakneck speed around the world. How do we get our sales forces, how do we get our inventory control done globally with the existing technologies we have, whilst making it safe and secure?
Cameron and Ronks, would you talk to us about your classes that you're taking right now? Do you think they're hands-on enough? Do you feel like they're really preparing you for the cyber battlefield of the future? Cameron, I saw you nodding when I was asking about quantum computing. Are you working on that already?
I'm not working on it. I don't understand it at all, but I love it.
All right, you got a few years to get up to speed, but not much time.
But it's really interesting. I mean, how like entangled particles, how you can observe them, and then regardless of distance, it will instantly become that state when you observe it. You can't really transfer information, I hear, but it's still really interesting to me, especially the impact for quantum computing with encryption. One of the major backbones of encryption these days is using primes, and calculating primes is not easy with conventional computing. But with quantum computing, it completely approaches the problem differently, so it's much easier to calculate primes, and that has a negative impact on encryption. But that sort of technology is really, I look forward to that. I want to do that later on. I want to take these up-and-coming technologies like quantum computing and artificial intelligence and figure out how to apply that to like a security field. Because, I mean, could you imagine an artificial intelligence that can design some sort of cybersecurity implementation I love it.
Ronks?
And with me, as far as the cybersecurity things that I see involving, as far as the cloud computing, cryptocurrency, like yesterday I was at a meetup with like some of the co-founders of IOTA there in Crystal City, so they got to speak about how they started their nonprofit, and kind of want to get my foot in the door and learn a little bit more about this cryptocurrency and how it works and the whole schema of it and everything. And so right now I'm actually taking a network computer attack and hacking class, so that class I'm hoping it's a little bit more hands-on, so I'm preparing for some cyber competitions that my school is going through, so like National Cyber League, and then they're gonna have tryouts for CCDC and I believe the Cyber Fusion down in Lexington at VMI. So those are like some of the things I'm looking forward to.
Mike, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about a new program, or at least a new class you have underway at the University of Maryland that's trying a new way to help students get a better foundational understanding of how to code.
So actually, I would like to make a plug for an article in the New Atlantic by James Somers. I was reading it on the way here. It's called The Coming Software Apocalypse. If there's anything you take away from what I say today, it's go read this article, because it very effectively describes how much of a challenge we face because of the growing complexity of software, and because of, as a result, the myriad of vulnerabilities that can be part of that software. So being able to teach students to be computer scientists, to be software engineers effectively, means that we need to help them really understand the fundamentals of how software works and how to build it appropriately. And we're looking at a way of using a new teaching language. It's called How to Design Programs is the name of the methodology. It's been piloted at other universities. And in order to bring in the sort of non-traditional student and to make the more traditional student the sort of geeky white guy stereotype that you might know about, to put them a little bit off their game and to force them to think a little bit differently. I think this program is really great for that. So far we have a much higher population of women in this program. We have more underrepresented groups in the program, and at least initial surveys are showing that people are feeling more comfortable in the way that we're teaching things. They feel less like an outsider. So we'll see. Within a year or two, we'll have more data to evaluate it.
Well, it's time for questions. So we've got a lot. Let's go for a mic runner. Whoever's closest, you pick a hand there.
Thank you very much. My name's Laura Bate. I'm working on cybersecurity workforce development at New America. And one of the trends that we have often seen is that relative to the need of employment in cybersecurity, there are relatively few entry-level positions. It seems like the alignment between a lot of the programs and a lot of the hiring managers just isn't set up correctly. So my question is, in your programs, what do you experience that really sets students up to get through that first 2 years, 5 years of work experience that so many job postings are calling for?
Take that.
Well, for example, I was just speaking to a firm the other day, and I brought one of the representatives into the class about security clearances. So one of the issues we're dealing with in this particular part of the country is whether you're working for the government or one of the many, many government contractors, security clearances are required. And most private sector companies will not spend the money up front for younger people. They would rather invest it in us. And we have to break away from that. I think this gentleman was with a human resources group in the company, and he was finally able to get to his management group and say, I needed a disposable amount of money to take young people and get them security rated if we're going to bring them in. So the biggest concern I see in cybersecurity is getting the young people security clearances to work in these fields. They're being excluded, and yet then we go poaching into things like the military. Where people come in the military, they come up for their next re-up, and they're saying, no, I'm leaving and going into the private sector. So we're all poaching from the same pool right now, and I think we need private industry needs to look at an investment of a security clearance into a younger person and say, it's worth rolling the dice.
All right, next question. Maybe on this side of the room. Let's move over here.
Hi, I'm Tony Fowler. I work at the U.S. Department of Education. And in my experience and observation, I can tell you that there are a lot of kids that are not college age that have skills for cyber. I had the opportunity of meeting the National Cyber Patriot team, the national winners of the Cyber Patriot competition, and we're sitting around the table, and I'm like, what's next? Can you get a job? Well, it's against the law for us to get a job. So I think that what I would suggest is that there is a glass floor and related to age when it comes to the cyber community. And I would suggest that there are other technical industries where there are kids who have skills that could be acknowledged and recognized, and have kids that are hired that are 17 years old, for instance. But they're not being hired, they're not even being acknowledged, and of course, in some states, it's against the law for them to get a professional job at that age. So,
how young is too young?
So I guess I'd like to think about the question differently, which is stepping back, if you had a lot of cars that didn't work very well, would you say we need to create many more jobs for auto mechanics? Or would you say we need to figure out how to build cars better so that they work better and we need less mechanics as a result? I would say that a lot of focus now on cybersecurity and cybersecurity hiring is more on here's a system that was built terribly, let's figure out how to put duct tape on it and put walls in front of it and hope everything doesn't fall down anymore. And instead, we need to be focusing on rethinking the way we build our infrastructure so that it's more sound to begin with. And I would suggest that you need to be thinking bigger picture, broader fundamentals, more that's a place where college education, I think, is really valuable, and you want to hire people out of college in that case.
Scott, did you want to add to that?
You know, I agree. And, you know, we have to look at a lot of the jobs that are still also available for younger people are those kind of cubicle jobs where we've got a certain amount of computer work involved to their stage, and then there's a human dynamic that comes in. You know, you're a packet filter person. So this packet filter is coming through and it's stopping at you, and you are the human face, and you're doing some menial task with that very quickly to send that packet through to the next level. There's a lot of that type of employment, and that's not going to be attractive to young people
No one's
investing
going to do
time.
that for very long.
They're not.
Right?
But it's a huge
I have
part
a
of the
nephew
industry.
working at Fort Meade in
Right.
cybersecurity. He can't tell me what he does, or you'd have to kill me. But I think he's actually doing very little right now. And he's been there, you know, he's approaching a year, and I don't think he's been really given anything to do. I have a friend in the intelligence world who says, well, that's what you do for the first couple of years. You take out the garbage. And that doesn't appeal.
I was an officer in the military, so I had an enlisted person take out
Canada,
the rubbish.
right?
But you're right. But even as a young second lieutenant, there was coffee to be made. Yes.
Well, I hate to tell you, we are out of time. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you all so much, Scott, Mike, Cameron, and Ronks.
Thank you.
Next panel. Thank you.
Now, for a conversation about cyber defense around the world, please welcome Andrea Glorioso, Counselor for the Digital Economy and Cyber at the European Union. Samir Jain, a partner at Jones Day Law Firm and former Senior Director for Cybersecurity Policy for the National Security Council. And Gordon Goldstein, Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and Managing Director at the technology investing firm Silver Lake. Back to lead the conversation, Steve Clemens.
Okay, now we're going to talk about the world. You're going to be my Dr. Strangelove, okay, on all the bad things. But before I get there, let me start with you, Samir. One of the questions as you sort of look at cyber defense or cyber offense as well is what kind of norms are evolving in the international system that you think matter? I mean, you did this for Barack Obama and Susan Rice. You were out there trying to do smart policy in cyber. So I'm interested in what some of the features of those norms are and whether or not you feel that we're succeeding in evolving towards them.
I think it's a mixed picture. I think we've made some progress at the UN and in sort of over multilateral and bilateral relationships where, you know, there's been some consensus on norms around not attacking critical infrastructure or there's some agreements.
Do you believe that? I mean, do you believe that the states that are participating are not attacking each other's critical infrastructure?
I think, I mean, you have to differentiate between state actors, sort of cutouts, people who are sort of affiliated with states versus and cyber criminals. I think there's a lot of what I would call preparation, so that people are positioning, the nation states are positioning themselves so that in the event of a conflict or something like that, they would be in position, so that they may be positioning malware.
So that's a mutual assured destruction thing?
Almost like that. But I think even as we've made some progress, and it's been, you know, halting, and, you know, the UN group of government experts this year wasn't able to agree on additional norms. I think the flip side of that, and where we're having a lot of trouble, is figuring out, even if we get agreement on some norms, how do we enforce them? In other words, what's the punishment or the consequence if you don't, in fact, obey that norm? And I don't think we've figured that out yet.
When did you leave the White House?
January.
Did you punish anybody?
I think we did in some sense. I mean, you know, we imposed sanctions, for example, against certain Russian actors in December in light of
Did that feel good?
It felt good. Was it effective? I mean, did it accomplish a lot? I'm not sure.
Andrea, you have the portfolio here in Washington representing the EU, which must be a complicated task representing all those countries. How do you feel the norm building is going on, at least in the transatlantic relationship?
Well, I think transatlantically, first of all, if you allow me, we do not represent member states. Each member state is on embassy here. We represent the union within its competencies, which include indeed a lot of the cybersecurity stuff that we're talking about. I think that transatlantic, there is actually quite a bit of agreement between the US and the European Union and its member states. And you can see that in the discussion in the UN with some differences. I mean, France can disagree from time to time, and that's okay. So I don't think there is any particular
stuff that we really disagree on. In fact, I would argue that with this new administration, cyber is probably the area where we find most continuity, mostly because as far as you can see, for the time being at least, the work of the current administration is very much a continuation of the work of the previous administration. So from our perspective, from that point of view, we don't see any major problem. The only, diplomatically I shouldn't say it, but perhaps concern that we have is that right now it's slightly difficult to find the counterparts in the administration.
I was going to say,
who
do you deal with? Like, who's your interlocutor?
But, you know, at the State Department just recently, there was the appointment of the Assistant Secretary for, there was a merge of the previous digital economy and cyber position in the State Department, so we now have that interlocutor, whom I met, is great. We now have a new, at least appointed Secretary for Homeland Security. So we kind of have the counterparts, but certainly I think that we are still waiting for the full picture to form the administration.
Have you thought that you might have continuity because there's nobody been appointed to undo what the Obama
No, that's not what I
did?
said. But no, actually, no, jokes aside, there is actually a very affirmative action by the current administration, which was the executive order by the White House back in May, I think. That is the policy of the White House and the federal government as far as we can tell on cybersecurity. And if you look at that executive order, which for the time being is very much about reviewing the internal preparedness of the federal government, and also, that's of course very interesting for us, preparing the international cyber engagement strategy of the US government. If you look at that executive order, what is on paper as opposed to the various drafts that were leaked from January until May, that executive order is very much in continuity as far as we can tell with the work of the previous administration.
So Gordon, I'm grossly simplifying what I just heard, but norms are evolving, structures are coming in, warm and fuzzy, sounds good. Dr. Strangelove, do you see the world the same way?
Well, while diplomats at the UN are busy continuing a discussion about norms, perhaps not as effectively as they should, and in Europe the conversation continues. While that dialogue diplomatically is going on, the great cyber game is being played, and it's being played with enormous intensity. And I would argue that we have reached an inflection point in the past 6 months that should give all of us pause. In May, those of you who were tracking the news observed that 200,000 computers in 150 countries around the world were infected with a virus called the WannaCry virus. It shut down hospitals, rail links, and production lines. The Department of Homeland Security attributed that to North Korea. The following month in June, there was a hack in Ukraine. It hit 2,000 targets and eventually spread to 65 different countries. And Ukraine attributed the attack to Russia. What we now know is that those cyber weapons, those offensive cyber weapons, were stolen from the United States, from the National Security Agency, from our cyber command.
So the NSA is getting hacked. What chance of survival do we have, right? So,
as one of those movie titles said, be afraid, be very afraid. If the dominant cyber power in the world, which I believe the United States still is, competing with China and Russia in Iran and North Korea. If the dominant cyber power in the United States cannot safeguard its own offensive cyber weapons, and they end up in the hands of third parties and then in the hands of rival nation states, how much progress are we making in alleviating the threats of the global cyber risk environment? I think this is an extraordinarily important kind of epical moment in how the game is played.
I had no idea how dark you could be, but I'm impressed. But
playing to tight.
You know, no, but I think in this area, when we're looking at the ecosystem, one of the things that's happened recently, I've had the privilege of talking to Ambassador Mike Rogers of the NSA, who's dual-hatted. So he's head of the National Security Agency and also head of the Cyber Command, which is now a full combatant command. We have some folks from there here. You know, he's talked a lot about, you know, in the world of norms, almost trying to figure out how you get back to a system of deterrence, how you create, you know, it sounds like a more punitive side, but how do you bring back some of the risk-reward dimension or punishment reward dimension of this? And Samir, I know you've thought about this in terms of policy framework, and you know, is it achievable? Because you just mentioned North Korea and Russia, two countries of vastly different resources in this arena. What should be shocking is North Korea I can't believe North Korea can penetrate. I mean, how does North Korea do it? It's the most cut-off nation in the world, and yet somehow it has extraordinary capacity. What would you do? I mean, how do you fix this?
I mean, look, I agree that in the foreseeable future, the cyber problem in many respects is going to get worse before it gets better, because I think the attack surface is growing, the number of actors who are able and willing to engage in cyber attacks is increasing, and frankly, we haven't seen some of the worst kinds of cyber attacks that we could. So I think we're very much at the beginning stages.
What are those?
So, I mean, we haven't seen many cyber attacks yet that have physical consequences. We saw, the attack on the Ukraine power grid. We've seen, ransomware that has some effect on hospitals, but we haven't really seen major attacks, dams being taken over and the sluice gates being opened and causing flooding downstream, which is very possible. And we haven't seen attacks that, what I would call attacks on data integrity, so that instead of stealing information or denying access to information through ransomware, someone goes in to a financial system and adds a 0 to a trading order or deletes a 0, or goes into a hospital system and changes the dosing information for patients. And so, you get changes in the integrity of the information, it's not recognized, and people act on that, and you have an undermining of confidence in the whole system, the financial
What about the
system.
Securities and Exchange Commission hack and Edgar? You don't think that somebody may have gone in and shifted information here and there inside Edgar?
It's certainly possible. I mean, there's, as far as I know, no public indication that happened, but yeah, that would be a possible. I mean, but that's the kind of attack that I'm talking about in terms of one way in which this is going to get worse before it gets better. And I think, look, I mean, I think one of the things that we tried to do, and I think this administration is continuing, is to recognize that in order to tackle the cyber problem, to increase deterrence, you really have to look at all tools of government. In other words, a cyber attack can't simply be responded to on a cyber level. You have to look at, whether it's sanctions or other economic measures, diplomacy, law enforcement, and all of these different tools have to be brought to bear. Are we there yet in terms of achieving deterrence? Clearly not.
Can I jump in on this question? You've identified the seminal question: how do you reinforce our cybersecurity program, our cybersecurity strategy, with an element of deterrence, which has been lacking? And some of our best thinkers in the U.S. foreign policy community are really focusing on this now. Joe Nye, the professor at Harvard, who's been one of the leading political scientists of his or any generation, has just written a tremendous article on deterrence and dissuasion in cyberspace, which students of the field, I recommend it to you. One can argue that to some degree there is an element of deterrence. The big threat that people have been worried about for 10 years was that preemptive attack on our critical infrastructure. Richard Clarke wrote a book 10 years ago imagining a preemptive cyber attack that would take down our power grid, that would have planes flying into each other, that would be blowing up power plants and so forth. Happily, that has not passed. But while the most severe risks have not materialized, the most pervasive risks have only grown, and they've grown exponentially. And they're the kind of attacks that are below preemptive war, below an attack on critical infrastructure, and it's industrial espionage, it's stealing of our intelligence secrets, and it's this massive problem of global cybercrime, which some estimates say is $750 to $1 trillion a year, $750 billion to $1 trillion. So there's this great irony. We've avoided the worst outcome, but the most pervasive ones we've not mitigated.
Andrea, let me ask you to take off your EU hat for a minute, and
I can't.
But I'm interested in in having an offshore perspective of us. When you look at what Russia has done with hybrid war in places like Ukraine and elsewhere, what's happened and whatnot, do you look at the United States as slightly befuddled, uncertain? I mean, how do you look at the American, both private sector and public sector, response to some of the things happening in the world? And are you worried?
So first of all, I'm not sure we would like to be called an offshore center of anything, but besides that, so you're asking for my personal view, and that's what I'm going to offer you, so this is not the official EU position. I think that the way I certainly look at the Americans after more than 3 years here is that I find you guys a bit naive, to be completely blunt and honest, in the sense that the kind of hybrid warfare that people are alleging has happened here in the US is something that is very familiar to us in Europe for decades. It's not anything new. And independently of who actually is behind those alleged attacks, and by the way, I would also like to point out that when we talk about norms and in all this discussion, let's not forget that attribution is still very difficult. Any country can claim that another country is conducting an attack. That doesn't mean that that country, and whether that country is the US or Russia or a European country, et cetera, let's keep that in mind. So there is that. Secondly, I think that we should not keep in mind that this is not so much an American issue. I think it's an advanced economies issue, so it's European and American. The reason why the WannaCry, or one of the reasons why the WannaCry virus that Gordon has mentioned was so effective is because 99% of the systems that were attacked with that particular virus were unpatched for a vulnerability that had been known for years. So there are geopolitical issues, there are state actors that are moving there, so it is a dangerous environment, but let's not forget that a lot of what we're talking about is unfortunately the baseline of very common cyber hygiene is very low, and this is true in the US as it is in Europe. I would argue, as a European in this wonderful country, you have perhaps a slightly even worse problems because your IT penetration is slightly higher than in Europe. It depends on the European country, actually, but by and large, you have IT systems penetrating the internet or whatever, penetrating into your core infrastructure at an even higher degree than you can find in Europe and other countries, and in this way you're more vulnerable. But again, let me underline that, yes, there are kind of state-level geopolitical issues, we need to address those, but there are also very basic issues of patching, of basic security that are not being addressed.
And this problem is going to get worse because with the advent of the Internet of Things and the spread of connected devices through homes, factories, and the like, in which it's not clear that the incentives are there to actually integrate security even to the same level that you have in the rest of the infrastructure. I think this problem of basic cyber hygiene is going to get worse.
How is there not the incentives there to embed an Internet of Things environment? When you have companies like Cisco or Accenture or Microsoft and others that provide the capillaries and the system for some of this to work, I hear this thing about there not being enough incentives. What are the right incentives to get it? I mean, it just sounds crazy to me.
First and foremost, I would say that because it is a very complex environment, and we should not forget that, we should not be too quick to attribute responsibility to companies which are trying, whether they're American, European, or from elsewhere, they're trying to do their best by and large. But the environment is complex. From our perspective, and here I'm putting back the EU hat because this is an official position / reflection that we are conducting in Europe, the attribution of liability is not at all clear. When something goes wrong, who is liable? And as we're moving towards an Internet of Things world in which you have a toaster which is connected to the internet to understand when at what time, and by the way, it's probably connected to my tracker to understand at what time I'm waking up, whether that morning I want white bread or black bread or whatever. If something goes wrong, and if that toaster is used, for example, for a distributed denial of service attack, and this is not science fiction, this is what happened with the Mirai botnet 1 year ago, more or less. Who is responsible? Is it the toaster producer? Is it the tracker producer? Is it whomever has been handling the data, processing of data, communication of data? Until we manage to come to some clarity on who has liability there. And there are various ways in which we can do it, and we have our own ideas, but they're not necessarily the right ideas. The problem is that companies will never, rationally speaking, no company will ever invest money into something until they're told, if you don't do that, there is going to be a cost for that.
This is a critical question, and I'm going to play the type for you because I know you'll like it. I hosted a meeting at the Council on Foreign Relations last spring. The title of it was, "Will the Internet of Things be a cybersecurity disaster?" And the question is, the question is not a facetious question. It's a real question. There are 1 billion additional connected devices every quarter. Every quarter, 1 billion additional connected devices are connecting to the internet. And we have not had this difficult discussion about how we're going to achieve the basic modicum of safety and protection in that evolved
And what's important, I think, is that as you get all these devices out there, it's not simply that those devices are targets in and of themselves, but they can be weaponized and used essentially as weapons against the rest of the infrastructure, which is what happened with the Mirai botnet. So it sort of has an exponential effect on the problems of security.
Just before I go to the audience, I want to ask you quickly about China. If we were doing this event 2 years ago, China would dominate the discussion. Now we're talking about a lot of other countries. And Samir, I know you were involved in the Xi Jinping-Obama discussion on establishing norms and getting China to back off, whether it has or not. I think you're in a slightly different. You believe that China's been a good player, a good behavior, ought to get a gold star.
Well, I'm not sure I would go that far.
Okay.
I think it's...
You go partly there, right?
Partly there.
Yeah.
I think it's true that if you look
a
at...
purple star.
If you look at the amount of, cyber-enabled IP theft, which was the main focus of that agreement, that China or Chinese actors have engaged in, that has been reduced. And I think the government has said that, but I think also third-party cybersecurity firms, private cybersecurity firms, CrowdStrikes of the world and whatnot, have seen a reduction. Does that mean they've stopped? Absolutely not. Does that mean they couldn't increase? I actually think what they've done is become more strategic. In other words, I think previously what happened is that there was sort of whatever we can hack, we will hack, whereas now there's a little bit more control and more strategy, and they're more strategic about what it is that they're hacking. So
it's not a good story.
Can I jump in on this? And I didn't know I could do that, but I will take off again my hat and offer a personal perspective.
I love it when you do that.
This is great. Yeah, no, I love it too. There are many things I would like to say that I cannot say because of the hat. So, look, personal observation. I think it's important and very much related to what you asked me before. How do non-Americans see what's happening here in the U.S.? Let's not forget that, and by the way, the European Union and China have deep disagreements on many, many, many issues. I don't think we can be defined as friends, and I want that to be clear. But I think it's important for the US public and for US policymakers to understand that outside of the US, it is actually the US that is most often considered to be the worst offender when it comes to cyber attacks and cyber espionage and all this kind of stuff, which, by the way, personally, I believe all countries do that. And when we look at this from an international relation perspective, let's not forget cyber is not different from this point of view from any other policy in the international environment. States are selfish actors. They will do what they believe is strategically best for them. And so in a way, I think that sometimes in the debate here in the US, there is a little bit, China is so bad because it's doing this, this, and this. If you were in their situation, you would probably do the same. I think that attributing morality to actions of states in international environment is not a good way to address the real and concrete concerns that, by the way, the US and Europe together have vis-a-vis the behavior of China in the cyber environment.
Gordon?
Well, I don't disagree with that, and I do believe we live in a realist world of significantly evolving cyber threats. What's interesting, though, is to look at the primary cyber actors and to try to assess their geopolitical incentive structure. And I think of your comment about China, they've emphasized going after intellectual property, they've emphasized espionage. But we haven't seen any evidence that I'm aware of that they've tried to penetrate into our actual political institutions with the intensity and methodical aggression and audacity as Russia has purportedly done. And it's interesting to look from a US perspective, the threats vary from different cyber actors. And for Vladimir Putin, who is ostensibly trying to undermine the cohesion of our democratic institutions and the cohesion of the Western alliance, it's a different set of incentives than it is from looking from Beijing, which has other goals.
Thank you. Let's go to you. Questions, thoughts, right here in front. We have a mic. Oh. Thank you so much. I'll give you a round of applause for all the running. Hi.
Oh,
it's Takeo, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Hi, my name's Takeo McCullough. My question really is for you, Andrea. Can you speak a little bit to GDPR or the General Data Privacy Regulation that the EU just is actually about to implement in this coming May, and where that lies in the establishment of the cyber frontier between the EU versus the rest of the world?
Thank you, and I'm going to ask for short form so we can get a couple real fast. Sure. Yeah.
So should I
Yeah,
say?
please.
Yeah. Look, very briefly, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, is the law of the land in the EU since last year, if I remember correctly. Indeed, it will become enforceable as of May 2018. I think that what really matters in terms of non-European actors is that there is a provision in the GDPR, which, by the way, we believe it was always from a jurisprudential point of view, was always the case, but now it's statutorily put in the law, that if you handle, if you do business with Europeans, if you handle data of Europeans, then that European law should apply.
Thank you. Yes, right in the middle.
Oh, that was fast. We can perhaps talk more about this later.
Right there. Yes.
Wow.
Hi, I'm Nicole Carlin. I'm with the Internet Society, and my question is, if you could
talk to the people negotiating NAFTA right now, what big opportunity would you insist that they talk to their colleagues about?
So NAFTA and the net.
I'm going to pass that off.
Samir?
I mean, I'm not a NAFTA expert, so, but, you know, I think the question of sort of trans-border data flows is an important one, and, you know, it's something that could be dealt with in NAFTA. I know it was sort of an issue in the TPP that was eventually, that we were pulled out of. So I think thinking through sort of those kinds of issues, you know, whether it's done in the context of NAFTA or otherwise, is sort of an important
question. I saw another hand. Oh, in the very back.
And that was NAFTA in 20 seconds. So.
Hi, Mark Batenchuk from Scope Group. We are the only cybersecurity recruiting company in the DC metro area. And so one of the things that I always like to try to do is look around the corner. You all are experts, and as we wrap up this great presentation, can you guys give us a little insight as to what we all might be talking about in a year, what the topics might be 1 year from now?
Gordon?
In the industry?
So as someone who's a participant in this space, you're familiar with the proposition that the reason why the cybersecurity threat is so acute is because offense is much stronger than defense. And in the effort to kind of craft a strategy to deal with it, we talk about advances in technology. One of them is machine learning, and perhaps that could be very meaningful. The other is the cloud. I think we'll be talking about that on defense. But our antagonists are incredibly resourceful as well, and they're going to apply the tools of machine learning as well. So this oscillation between offensive advantage and defensive response, I think, is going to escalate and become increasingly sophisticated.
And with that, I want to thank Andrea Glorioso, who occasionally represents the delegation of the European Union, Samir Jain with Jones Day, and Gordon Goldstein with Silver Lake and the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Steve and Kathleen, for leading all the conversations this morning, and thank you to all our speakers. I don't think this was an especially reassuring conversation this morning, but perhaps it was a galvanizing one. We heard a variation on the same theme all morning long. Be afraid. Be very afraid. The bad guys only need to get it right once. If you build a 10-foot fence, the enemy will build a 12-foot ladder. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Clearly, there's an urgency to the conversation we had here today and some brilliant minds working to address the evolving cyber threat, and we will continue to follow this conversation. My deep thanks to Accenture, our underwriter, for making this morning possible. We're very, very grateful for that. And mostly, I'd like to thank all of you in the audience. I know this is a very busy group of people, so thank you for taking so much time with us. We know how precious that is. One request before you dash out: you have on your chairs or your tables a short survey from us. You'll also get an email from me asking for your feedback. It's very important to us and helps us make these forums better and better each time. With that, thank you so much and have a wonderful day.